She ran for 3 days straight through ice and blood and darkness. And when she finally fell, she fell at the feet of the most dangerous man alive. They said Ronan Draegor destroyed everything he touched. They said no one entered his sacred grounds and lived to speak of it. They were wrong about one thing: some people don't enter to live. They enter because dying anywhere else was the only other option. This is the story of a girl who was broken into pieces, then weaponized from every single wound. If you've ever been told your pain made you weak, stay until the very end. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button, because what happens next will change how you see suffering forever. The storm had no mercy. It hadn't had mercy for 3 days. Rain came down in sheets so thick a person couldn't see their own hands extended in front of their face, and the wind, gods, the wind, screamed through the black pine forest like something wounded and ancient and furious at the world. The trees bent, branches cracked and fell. The creek beds that had been dry all summer ran brown and violent with runoff, carving new channels through the earth as if the land itself was trying to rearrange its bones. Through all of it, she ran. Arden Vale's feet had long since stopped feeling like feet. They were two numb clubs at the end of her legs, striking earth and stone and root without sensation, propelled forward only by something deeper than instinct. Something that lived below the animal brain, below the survival reflex, something that whispered, "Not yet, not yet, not yet," in the rhythm of her ragged breathing. She was 22 years old and she had been running, in one form or another, for most of her life. But the last 3 days had been different. The last 3 days had been the kind of running that used up everything. She didn't dare look back. She knew what was behind her. She had smelled them. Her old keepers, the Blackridge hunters, their scent cutting through the rain-soaked pine and loam like hot iron through snow. They had dogs. They had numbers. They had the advantage of knowing this territory, because Blackridge Pack's land stretched for 60 miles in every direction from the compound where Arden had spent 7 years as something the law of packs didn't have a clean word for. Property was the word they used. Arden had other words. She kept them locked in a place behind her sternum, fed them the way you feed a coal. Not with air, but with patience, with time, with the absolute granite certainty that one day the fire would be needed. That day had finally come. She had run on the night the rain started, when the guards changed shift 20 minutes late, because the head enforcer, a thick-necked brute named Caswick, had been deep in a bottle of Black Vein whiskey and had forgotten to sound the rotation bell. 20 minutes. That was all she had needed. She'd memorized the gap in the eastern fence where the bottom rail had rusted through. She'd studied the patrol routes for 3 months, mapping them the way a scholar maps constellations, patiently, invisibly, with total commitment to precision. The gap was still there. She'd gone through it on her hands and knees, tearing her shirt on the jagged metal, feeling the sharp bite of rust along her ribs. She hadn't stopped to assess the wound. She'd simply run. Now, 72 hours later, the wound along her ribs had gone from sharp to hot to the dull, throbbing wrongness that meant infection was setting in. It was one of many problems. Her left knee had twisted badly on the second day when she'd slid down a rain-slick embankment and her foot had caught in a root. She could still move it, but every step sent a spike of white pain up through her thigh that made her vision swim at the edges. She'd torn a strip from her already ruined shirt and wrapped it tight, which helped some. Not enough. She was also starving. She'd eaten what she could. A handful of late-season berries she was almost certain weren't poisonous, the inner bark of a white birch that tasted like paper and sadness, water from every stream she'd crossed, which was the one thing the storm had given her in abundance. And she was lost. Not completely. She had a general direction, north and east, away from Blackridge territory, toward the borderlands that the Blackridge elders always spoke of in hushed, uncomfortable tones. She'd listened to those conversations carefully over the years. Information was the only currency available to her, and she'd spent years collecting it. The borderlands meant the Draegor territory. Even in her depleted, feverish state, Arden felt the cold thread of fear that the name produced. Ronan Draegor, the Alpha King. She'd heard his name spoken with the same tone people used for winter storms and deep water creatures. Not quite fear, not quite reverence, but the specific register that human voices made when they acknowledged something that operated entirely outside the normal rules of safety. He's killed packless wolves for crossing his lands without invitation. They say he doesn't take prisoners, just territory. His wolf is twice the size of any alpha I've ever seen, and I've seen plenty. She remembered those words. She also remembered something else. Something she'd overheard once, the single fragment that had lodged in her mind like a splinter and stayed there. Blackridge won't touch Draegor's lands. Won't even send scouts past the Black Pines. Something about a treaty that isn't really a treaty. More like a standing threat. If Blackridge feared Draegor's ground, then Draegor's ground was the one place they might not follow her. It was a desperate logic, the kind that only made sense when all the other options had already been eliminated. She'd aimed herself north and east and tried not to think too hard about whether she was trading one form of captivity for another. The Black Pines were different from the forest she'd been running through. She noticed the change gradually, the way you notice a room going quiet after being loud. Not all at once, but in stages. The trees grew taller, the undergrowth thinned. There were no game trails here, no old cuts where human or wolf kind had harvested timber. The forest had a density to it that was less about the closeness of the trees and more about the feeling of being watched. Not by something hostile necessarily, but by something aware. Her wolf senses, such as they were, prickled. Arden's wolf was a complicated subject. Most pack-born wolves fully shifted for the first time between 16 and 18. She had not. The ability was in her. She could feel it, had always felt it, a presence in her chest like something sleeping with one eye open. But the shift itself had never come. The Blackridge elders had decided early on that this was evidence of her worthlessness as a wolf, proof that whatever gift she carried was a corruption rather than a strength. They'd treated it as fact. She'd learned to nod and look at the floor and then, privately, disagree. She wasn't worthless. She was different. There was a gap between those two things that the people who'd held her chains had never bothered to explore. But they knew about the other thing. The ability she had been born with, or developed, or been marked with, depending on which theory she subscribed to on any given day. The pain-bearing. It had shown itself for the first time when she was 15 and a younger girl in the compound, a child named Sela, had broken her arm falling from the feeding platform. Arden had taken Sela's hand to pull her up and felt it. A rush of something that was unmistakably Sela's pain, flowing through the point of contact and into Arden's own body. Not a copy. The actual sensation, transferred, pulling out of Sela and settling into Arden like an unwelcome tenant moving into every room at once. Sela's arm had stopped hurting. Arden's had begun to throb. She'd hidden it for almost a year after that. Hidden it, analyzed it, tested it carefully when she could. She had learned its mechanics with the diligence of someone who understood that knowledge was either a weapon or a wound, depending on who held it. Then Caswick had seen her do it for a packmate who'd been injured in a training bout. And after that, hiding it was no longer possible. After that, they had begun to use her. She smelled the boundary marker before she saw it. A line of stones set with carved symbols and treated with something that carried the scent of iron and cedar and the particular musk of an alpha's territorial claim. She stopped at the edge of it, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her left knee screaming, her ribs radiating heat that had nothing to do with the summer storm. The rain was easing slightly. Through the dark tree canopies, she could see the sky beginning to lighten toward the gray of pre-dawn, though the clouds still hung heavy and low. Across the marker line, the forest continued. Behind her, faint but getting less faint, she heard dogs. She stood there for perhaps 5 seconds, in which she weighed every version of the future she could still imagine. Turning back was not one of them. Staying here was not one of them. There was only forward, into land that might kill her for trespassing, toward a king who had every reason to send her back to the people who owned her on paper. Or not. She crossed the boundary marker. She made it another mile before her legs stopped working. It was not a gradual failure. It was abrupt. One moment she was moving through a clearing at the edge of a wide, flat space of packed earth, surrounded by standing stones and carved wooden posts, and the next moment her left knee simply buckled and she went down. She hit the mud with her palms first, then her forearms, then her cheek. The ground was cold and very wet. Get up, she told herself. Get up now. Her body declined to respond. She managed to roll onto her back. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and she could see the sky through gaps in the clouds. That peculiar gray-violet that belonged to the last minutes before true dawn. The standing stones around her were enormous, 10 feet tall and carved with symbols she recognized from descriptions she'd heard. The gathering grounds of the Draegor clan. A sacred space, a meeting place for the pack at significant turns of the year. She had collapsed in the middle of the Alpha King's sacred gathering ground. Of course, she thought distantly, of all the places. She heard them before she saw them. Not the Blackridge dogs, but something else. Footsteps. Multiple sets, moving with the controlled precision of trained wolves who were not trying to be silent so much as simply had no reason to be anything else. Voices, too, low and clipped, cutting off as they cleared the tree line and saw what was lying in the mud in the center of their grounds. She turned her head. There were maybe 15 of them. Warriors, from the look of it. The build, the way they moved, the particular readiness in their postures. Several were already in partial shift, their eyes burning amber in the pre-dawn light. A few had weapons out, which was either reassuring, they considered her a threat significant enough to require weapons, or terrifying. They were going to use them. Then the group parted. He came through the gap they made for him, and Arden understood immediately why they made it. Not because they were commanded to, but because the alternative didn't occur to them. He was tall in the way that certain things were tall, trees in old forests, cliff faces, waterfalls. Not merely a matter of inches, but of presence, of the way the space around him organized itself in response to his existence. He was dark-haired, severe-featured, and the amber burning in his eyes was not the uncertain flicker she'd seen in younger wolves mid-shift, but a steady, controlled flame that suggested something permanently altered at the root of him. Ronan Draegor, Alpha King of the Northern Reaches. He looked at her the way she imagined a man might look at a problem he hadn't expected to find in his living room. He crouched. She'd expected many things from the stories. She hadn't expected him to crouch down to her level in the mud without hesitation, without apparent concern for what her contaminating presence might mean for his dignity or his clean clothing. His eyes swept over her with the clinical efficiency of someone used to assessing damage quickly. She was acutely aware of what he was seeing, the shirt barely worthy of the name, torn and blood-stained and missing its sleeves, those she'd used for wrapping, the scars. Gods, the scars. She'd stopped cataloging them years ago, the way you stopped counting raindrops. They were simply part of the geography of her skin now, old ones that had faded to silver, newer ones still carrying the pink-red edge of not quite healed, patterned in ways that were unmistakably deliberate. The kind of marks that didn't come from accidents or battles, the kind that came from a particular type of sustained intent. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Something moved through them, a shift so deep and sudden it was like watching a calm sea surface disturbed by something rising from the depths. The amber intensified. Around him, without any visible signal from him, every warrior present took a half step back. "Who did this to you?" His voice was lower than she expected. Rougher. Not unkind exactly, but carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. She opened her mouth. She'd had the answer ready for years, locked behind her sternum with the fire, waiting for a moment like this. She'd imagined saying it 1,000 times, imagined the relief of finally speaking the name out loud to someone who had the power to respond to it. "Blackridge," she said, or tried to say. The word came out smaller than she intended, scraped thin by exhaustion and fever, and 3 days of barely breathing through the running. "Blackridge Pack, they—" "Name them," he said. Not louder. Somehow more direct. Each word landing with exact weight, nothing wasted. "Name the individuals." She looked at him. The pre-dawn light was growing, and she could see him more clearly now. The set of his jaw, the particular tension around his eyes that wasn't anger yet, but was a controlled precursor to it. Something in her that had been braced for so long began, fractionally, to unbrace itself. "Caswick Morn," she said. "He's the head enforcer, and the alpha pair, Drace Holt and his mate Velara. They're the ones who—" The fever chose that moment to remind her it was still very much present. The clearing spun sideways. The standing stones tilted at impossible angles. She was aware of her body deciding, at a cellular level, that it had fulfilled its obligations and was now clocking out. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Ronan Draegor's face, specifically the expression on it, which she would spend a great deal of time thinking about later. It was not pity. She'd seen enough pity in her life to recognize it, and it was a thin, useless emotion that rarely led anywhere good. This was something else. This looked, if she was reading it right, and she'd spent 7 years studying the faces of people who had power over her, developing a precision in that reading that most people never needed, like intent, like a decision being made. His hands caught her before she hit the mud again. Shut. She came in and out of consciousness for what felt like a long time. There were fragments, a ceiling of dressed stone, torchlit. The sensation of warmth after the long cold, which was almost worse than the cold itself. The way warmth made all the cold, numb things begin to feel again. Voices she didn't recognize, speaking in the clipped shorthand of people who worked together constantly. The sharp smell of medicinal herbs, something astringent and something else that was sweeter. Someone was cleaning the wound on her ribs. She felt it distantly through the fever haze. Can count at least 40 distinct scarring events, a woman's voice said. Careful, clinical, but with something underneath it. This wasn't random. Someone made decisions here. I can see that. His voice, closer than she expected. A pause. My lord, the Blackridge representative arrived at the outer gate 20 minutes ago. They're requesting, tell them to wait. A beat. Tell them the king is not available. They won't accept. Tell them, Ronan said, and something in the specific way he said it made the rest of the sentence unnecessary, that I said they'll wait. Silence. Then the woman's voice, very quietly, almost to herself. She must be something, to make him finish your work, Ronan said. Not harshly, but finally. Arden let herself sink back into the dark. She woke fully sometime in the middle of the day. She knew it from the light angling through a high, narrow window. Old stone fortress design, the kind built by people who wanted illumination without vulnerability. She was in a bed. This was not, in itself, remarkable. She had slept in beds before, but this bed had been made with consideration. Clean linens, blankets heavy enough to matter, a pillow that was actually a pillow rather than a folded rough-weave sack. These were details that landed with a disproportionate weight when you'd been denied them for long enough. She sat up carefully. Her ribs had been properly dressed, and the infection heat had subsided slightly. Not gone, but managed. Her knee had been wrapped with something that smelled medicinal, and held it at an angle that reduced the pain from shrieking to complaining. She had been dressed in clean clothes that weren't hers, a simple shirt, soft trousers, while she was unconscious, which she filed away as information she wasn't sure how to feel about. The room was spare but not bare. Stone walls, a fire and a hearth large enough to indicate northern construction, a table with a water pitcher, and a plate of food that someone had left and that was still, she discovered, faintly warm. She drank half the water in one continuous pull and then made herself slow down. She was evaluating the distance to the room's single door when it opened. Not Ronan. A woman, middle-aged, brown-haired, with the particular economy of movement that spoke to decades of competence. She was carrying a tray with more food and what appeared to be medicine, and she looked at Arden with an expression that was professional and cautious, and something else beneath both of those. You're awake, the woman said. Not a question. I'm awake, Arden agreed. I'm Ren, pack healer. She set the tray down. How are you feeling? Better than I was. You were feverish and severely depleted. The wound on your ribs had the beginning of a serious infection. You were also showing signs of exposure and moderate malnutrition. Ren said this the way a person reported facts, not without feeling, but with the discipline of someone who had learned to contain feeling within the framework of information. You've been unconscious for about 14 hours. 14 hours. Arden absorbed this. The Blackridge representatives, she said. Are they still here? Ren's expression shifted in a way that was carefully controlled and still communicated something clearly. They are. They've been told to wait. A pause. They've been waiting for 14 hours. The implication settled into the room between them. The king wants to speak with you, Ren said. When you're ready. He said, she paused, seeming to consider the phrasing. He said there's no rush, but that when you were well enough, he had questions. Arden looked at the food on the tray. Real food, not the compound's minimum sustenance rations, but actual food, prepared with attention. Tell him, she said. I'll eat first. Something moved across Ren's face that might have been, very briefly, approval. I'll tell him, she said. He was waiting in a room that was half study, half what she could only call a war room. Maps on every surface, notes in handwriting that was forceful and angular, shelves of bound records that had the organized look of things consulted regularly rather than displayed. A fireplace large enough to stand in. 2 chairs near the fire that were meant for sitting and thinking rather than ceremony. He was standing when she entered, which surprised her. He turned, and for a moment they simply assessed each other in the clear afternoon light. He looked, she thought, like someone who hadn't slept much. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there at dawn, or if they had, she'd been too delirious to register them. His expression was the controlled neutral of a person who had made a habit of not showing his hand prematurely. Sit, he said, and then almost immediately, in a tone that suggested he'd heard how that came out. Please. She sat. He sat across from her and regarded her for a moment without speaking. She let him. She'd learned long ago that silence was a test some people set, and that the correct response was to simply exist in it without flinching. Arden Vale, he said finally. That's the name they gave at the gate when they asked for you back. That's also the name you said when you were half conscious. You repeated it twice, I think, as an anchor. She hadn't known she'd done that. She filed that away too. It's my name, she said. They called you property. He said it without softening it. In their formal request, return of pack property, designation Vale. Those were the words. That's what they called me for 7 years. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Tell me about the ability. She looked at him steadily. He met the look without blinking. There was something in the directness of his gaze that was different from what she was used to. The Blackridge Alphas had looked at her with the assessing quality of someone calculating the use value of an object. This felt more like someone trying to actually see what was in front of them. It's rare, she said. I've only found 2 written records of it in things I managed to read, and both called it something different. I call it pain-bearing. I can absorb the physical pain and injury of someone else through direct contact, draw it into myself. Ronan was very still. And what happens to you when you do? I experience it. Whatever they were feeling, I feel it instead. The severity depends on how badly they're hurt. And then? And then I process it, metabolize it maybe, though I don't know the right word. It takes time. A bad injury could take a day, 2 days to move through me. During that time, I'm impaired. He was silent for a moment. Blackridge used this. Yes. How? She had told this story to no one. She had constructed it carefully in her own mind over years, building it into something she could look at directly without it unmaking her, something with clean edges and a narrative shape that gave it form rather than chaos. She told him. She told him about the first discovery, about Sela and the broken arm, and how the ability had made the healer's eyes go wide before he'd mastered his expression, and then, she understood only later, immediately reported it. She told him about the 2 years of what the Blackridge elders called assessment, which was a clinical word for a process that was not clinical at all. She told him about being used systematically, brought to injured fighters and told, in terms that made the alternative clear, to draw out their wounds. About how the damage she took on collected in her over time. About the scars that resulted not from external violence, but from internal accumulation. The body's record of everything it had absorbed and processed. She told him about the night 2 weeks ago when she'd overheard Caswick telling the Alpha pair about a potential sale. Her being transferred to another pack entirely. A group whose name she hadn't caught, but whose reputation she'd been able to infer from the specific pleasure with which Caswick described what they'd want to use her for. She'd decided that night that she would run or she would die running, and that both options were preferable to what was coming. Ronan listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not show, on his face, the full range of whatever he was processing. But she caught flickers, controlled anger, once, that pushed briefly to the surface before he pulled it back down. Something that she could have almost called anguish, very briefly, when she described the collection of damage over time. When she finished, there was a long silence. "They're going to come in greater numbers," he said finally. "They won't accept being turned away, not if they have 7 years of investment in you." "I know. I'm not sending you back." She looked at him. He said it the way he said everything, without performance, as simple fact. "That will mean a conflict," she said carefully. "Blackridge has been looking for a reason to test my boundaries for 3 years," he said. "They've been pushing. Small incursions, resource disputes. They've been building toward something." He paused. "You didn't create this situation. You just forced the timing." "You don't know me," she said. "You don't owe me protection." His amber eyes held hers, steady and direct. "No," he said. "I don't know you. But I know what I saw in that clearing, and I know what you just told me, and I know that whatever legal fiction Blackridge constructs to call you property, the law of pacts that I recognize doesn't permit what they did to you." A beat. "And I know—" He stopped. She waited. "There's something else," he said, more carefully now. "Something I'm still—" He seemed to be choosing words with unusual attention. "My wolf has been unsettled since the moment I saw you, which is not standard, which means something, though I'm not certain yet exactly what." She understood intellectually what he was describing. She'd heard of it. The recognition that could happen between potential mates, the instinctive certainty that operated below rational thought. She'd never expected it to be relevant to her own life. "I need to know," she said. "What happens to me here? If I'm under protection, what does that mean? What are the terms?" Something shifted in his face. Something that might have been, in a different man, a smile. "It means you are a guest in this house. It means you sleep in a room with a door that locks from the inside, and no one enters without your permission. It means you eat and you heal, and when you're ready, we talk about what comes next." A pause. "There are no other terms. You're not property here, Arden. You're a person." She looked at the fire for a moment because she needed to look at something other than his face, which was doing things to her composure that she wasn't prepared to examine yet. "You're a person." 7 words that should not have had the weight they did. She refused to let them destroy her equilibrium now, in front of him, in this chair that was meant for thinking. She would feel them later, privately, when she had earned the space. "The Blackridge representatives," she said, keeping her voice level. "What will you tell them?" He stood, signaling that the conversation was shifting to its conclusion. "I'll tell them," he said, "the same thing I told them this morning, only this time with more specificity." She looked up at him. "Meaning?" He looked down at her, and the amber in his eyes held the same steady, controlled flame she'd seen in the pre-dawn clearing Tafab. The fire of something that had already made its decision and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. "Meaning that no one takes what is under this pack's protection," he said, "and that if Drace Holt or Caswick Morn set foot inside my territory line again, they'll learn exactly how seriously I mean that." She held his gaze. 3 days of running, 7 years of carrying other people's pain in her own body, a childhood that had been swallowed by other people's calculations about her use value. And here, in a room full of maps and firelight, a king who was looking at her like she was worth the trouble of a war. She didn't trust it yet. Trust was something you built from evidence, and she had only 1 data point so far. But she was still breathing. She was in a locked room with a fire and clean linens and food that had been made with consideration. And the man who held this territory had looked at the story of everything done to her and said, "Not here, not while I'm standing." It was, Arden thought, a beginning. Outside the fortress walls, the storm was finally breaking. The last of the rain moved off to the east. In the courtyard below the window, she could hear voices. The sharp, frustrated tones of the Blackridge representatives being escorted, firmly, back toward the gate, with nothing but a message and the particular kind of silence that powerful men used as weapons. She pressed her palm flat against the wall of the room, the cold, dressed stone of a fortress that had stood for generations, and let herself, for the first time in 3 days, breathe. "Not yet over," said the voice in her chest. She knew. "But not over," she answered back. Outside the window, the sun broke through the retreating clouds for the first time in days. The Blackridge representatives left, but they didn't go far. Arden knew this the way she knew most things, not from being told, but from watching, from paying attention to the small signals that people in power forgot to conceal because they'd never had to develop the habit of concealment. She saw it in the posture of Ronan's outer gate sentinels the following morning, the way they stood with their weight slightly forward rather than the relaxed backward lean of men guarding a boundary. Nothing threatened. She heard it in the way conversation stopped when she entered a room and then resumed at a different register, lower, clipped, carrying the specific texture of information being managed. She'd lived in the Blackridge compound for 7 years. She knew what a pack under external pressure felt like from the inside. She said nothing about it. She ate the food that was brought to her room, real food still, and she was still adjusting to that, and let Wren check her ribs and her knee, and moved carefully through the stone corridors of the Draegor fortress when the healer said walking was acceptable. And she watched. The fortress was larger than it looked from the gathering grounds. 3 connected structures of different ages. The oldest part with walls thick enough to absorb an army, the middle section added in a period of expansion, the newest wing still carrying the smell of recent cut timber in its upper floors. It housed, she estimated, somewhere between 60 and 80 permanent residents, plus the warriors who rotated in and out on patrol schedules she hadn't yet fully mapped. She mapped them anyway. Old habit. The kind you didn't break because the alternative was vulnerability. On the 3rd day of her recovery, she encountered the problem of the pack itself. His name was Seaver, and he was the first of Ronan's inner warriors to make his feelings clear without the benefit of subtlety. She was in the corridor that connected the main hall to the eastern courtyard, moving with the careful deliberateness that her knee still required, when he stepped into the passage from a side room. He was big, not as tall as Ronan, but wider, built like something that had been compressed under great force and had responded by becoming denser. He had a scar along his jaw that was old enough to be silver, and the kind of eyes that cataloged threats the way a merchant cataloged inventory, reflexively, constantly. He looked at her and said nothing for a moment. The silence was a specific kind, waited. "You're the girl from the gathering grounds," he said finally. It was not warm. "I am," she said. "You've been here 3 days." He crossed his arms. "And in those 3 days, Blackridge has planted 2 reconnaissance camps within a mile of our eastern boundary. Ronan's had 3 tactical meetings that ran until past midnight, and 2 of our patrol captains have requested emergency resource reviews because of the increased border activity." He let that sit. "You see where I'm going?" "You're telling me I brought this here," she said. "I'm telling you Blackridge wants you badly enough to risk open conflict with the strongest pack in the northern reaches." He uncrossed his arms and tilted his head slightly. "Which makes me ask the question no one else seems to be asking out loud. What exactly are you, girl, that they want you back that badly?" She met his gaze steadily. "They want me back because they spent 7 years investing in something they think belongs to them." "And what is that something?" "That's between me and the king." Sever's eyes narrowed incrementally. "The king runs this pack, yes. But this pack is 63 wolves, and every one of them will fight if Blackridge comes across that boundary. Every one of them could die." He took 1 step forward, not threatening exactly, but establishing proximity in a way that was designed to make her feel the gap in power between them. "I've kept these people alive for 11 years as Ronan's first warrior. I don't ask questions for my health. I ask because that's the job." She understood, without difficulty, that he was not wrong. The logic was clean, and she would have deployed exactly the same argument herself in his position. "Ask Ronan," she said. "If he decides to tell you, then I'll talk." For a long moment he looked at her. Something shifted in his assessment. Marginally, barely, but she caught it. "Fair enough," he said, and moved past her. She exhaled slowly once he was gone and continued toward the courtyard. Ronan told her about Sevier that evening. They'd fallen into a pattern. Dinner in the small room off the main hall where the fireplace was oldest and the chairs had been worn comfortable by decades of use. Not a formal arrangement. He'd simply been there the first evening when she'd come down from her room, and they'd sat across the fire and talked, and it had happened again the second evening, and now it was simply where they were at this hour. "Sever asked about me today," she said. "I know." He was looking at the fire rather than at her. "He came to me this afternoon. I told him enough." "Does he know about the ability?" "He knows you're a pain bearer. He knows Blackridge exploited it." A pause. "He knows I'm not returning you, which he disagrees with on a tactical level, though he won't say so to my face." "He'll say it to mine," she said. "He already has." Ronan turned from the fire to look at her. "Did he threaten you?" "No. He made an argument." She considered. "He's not wrong. I did bring this here." "Blackridge's choices brought this here," Ronan said. "There's a difference." He held her gaze for a moment. "Sever's job is to keep the pack safe. He's good at it. He'll come around." "What if he doesn't?" "He will," Ronan said. And there was no arrogance in it, just the certainty of someone who knew the people around him. She looked at the fire. "I want to be clear about something," she said. I don't want to be someone who sits in a room while other people fight on my behalf, and I contribute nothing. That's not—" She paused, finding the right architecture for what she was trying to say. "That's not what I survived to become." He was quiet for a moment. "What are you proposing?" "I don't know yet. I'm still learning the layout of this place, the structure of your defenses. But I have 7 years of watching how Blackridge operates. I know their patrol patterns, their communication methods, how their command structure responds to pressure. That's information." "That's significant information," he said. "Then let me use it." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that looked like he was revising something. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Tactical room, 6th hour." He paused. "Bring everything you remember." She nodded. There was a moment of quiet in which the fire settled and popped, and neither of them felt the need to fill the space with words. "The bond," she said. She had been approaching the subject for 2 days, circling it the way you circle something you need to examine but haven't yet determined is safe. He was still. "You said your wolf has been unsettled," she said carefully. "I want to be honest with you. I feel something too. I don't fully understand it, and I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not someone who trusts easily, especially not fast. I'm not asking you to," he said, immediately without hesitation. "What I feel is mine to manage. I don't put that on you as obligation." She looked at him. "But it's there." "It's there," he agreed quietly. She filed that away in the place where she kept things that required careful handling, not dismissed, not acted on prematurely. Held. "Then we'll figure it out," she said, "after we deal with Blackridge." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. "After Blackridge," he agreed. The tactical room in daylight was even more dense with information than she'd first registered. The maps were layered, cross-referenced with color-coded notation systems that she needed 15 minutes just to decode the key for. Ronan had 4 of his senior wolves present. Sevier, whose expression was carefully neutral in a way that communicated active effort. A woman named Lais, who commanded the southern patrol routes, and who looked at Arden with open curiosity rather than suspicion. An older man named Bracht, who appeared to function as the pack's chief strategist, and who had the distracted energy of someone whose best thinking happened in parallel. And a young warrior named Tam, who was perhaps 19 and was doing a poor job of concealing the fact that he found the entire situation more fascinating than threatening. Ronan introduced her simply. "Arden Vale, 7 years inside Blackridge. She knows their operational patterns. Listen." Sever's neutral expression held. Lise leaned forward. Bracht uncapped a writing instrument and held it ready. Tam straightened. She talked for 2 hours. She told them about the patrol rotation cycles and the specific way they degraded in bad weather. Blackridge hunters were territorial but comfort-oriented, and a sustained rain dropped their patrol frequency by roughly 30%. She told them about the command hierarchy and the two critical gaps in it. Caswick Morn's loyalty was to whoever fed him and his bottle of Black Vein whiskey, which meant under sufficient pressure he'd prioritize his own survival over pack orders. And the alpha pair, Drace and Velora Holt, had a documented pattern of overcommitting forces in an initial engagement and then struggling to sustain when the initial push failed to resolve quickly. She told them about the messenger relay system. 4 fixed points, always staffed by lower-ranked wolves who were not fighters, which meant cutting those points would slow Blackridge's communication to a crawl in any extended engagement. She told them where the eastern perimeter had structural weaknesses that the Blackridge alphas knew about and would exploit as attack vectors. She told them about the dogs, because the dogs had been her constant nightmare for 3 days, and she wasn't going to leave that out. By the time she finished, the room had a different quality than it had when she'd walked in. Bract had filled 2 sheets of notes and was looking at them with the focused attention of someone doing rapid calculations. Lace had pulled 3 maps across the table and was already cross-referencing. Sever had uncrossed his arms somewhere in the middle of the second hour. Tam looked like someone had handed him the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. Sever looked at her. The specific quality of his assessment had shifted. Not warmly, not yet, but fundamentally. The inventory was being revised. The messenger relay points, he said. You said 4 fixed positions. Can you locate them on this? He turned a map toward her. She studied it for a moment, orientating herself. Then she took the writing instrument Bract extended without a word and marked 4 positions. Sever looked at Ronan. That's 3 of the 4 we identified from our own intelligence, Sever said. We'd missed the northern one. Ronan was looking at Arden. The northern relay. What's the terrain? Boggy, she said. They station it on a raised platform in the middle of the marsh because it gives line of sight to both the eastern road and the High Ridge path. Approach from the west is the only way in without being spotted, and the Black Ridge scouts think the western approach is too slow for a meaningful tactical unit. Is it? Lise asked. It is if you're moving a fighting force, Arden said. It's not if you're moving 2 people who know how to move quietly. There was a brief silence. You're not healed, Ronan said. My ribs are manageable. My knee is functional. She looked at him directly. I know that territory from the ground level. Anyone else you send in will be navigating from map approximations. She's right, Lace said, before Ronan could respond. Sever said nothing, which was its own kind of communication. Ronan held Arden's gaze for a moment that had more in it than the tactical question. 2 days, he said finally. We wait 2 more days and let Wren make sure that infection is fully clear. Then we discuss it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. And she had learned to read the terrain between those 2 positions. She nodded. 2 days. The 2 days passed, and the infection cleared, and Wren pronounced her knee stable enough for careful operation. And in those 2 days, the situation outside the fortress walls continued to evolve in directions that made the tactical question increasingly urgent. Bract brought the intelligence reports each morning. Blackridge had moved from 2 reconnaissance camps to 4. They'd been joined, according to 3 separate sources, by allied wolves from a pack called the Heron Reach. Smaller than Blackridge, but historically aligned with them, bringing the total opposing force to an estimated 90 combatants against Ronan's 63. There was more. Drace Holt had sent a formal communication to 3 neighboring packs, framing the situation as a matter of property law and lawful pack rights, and requesting, not demanding, requesting, which was a specific rhetorical choice, their endorsement of Blackridge's claim. 2 of the 3 haven't responded, Bract said, on the 3rd morning, placing the communication on the table in front of Ronan. The 3rd sent back a message that they considered the matter internal to the involved parties. Which means they won't intervene, Arden said. She was sitting at the table now as a matter of course, which had happened gradually enough that no one had formally acknowledged the shift. Which means they won't intervene, Bract confirmed, with a look that said he'd noticed the same thing. Holt is building a legal framework before he builds a military one, Ronan said. He wasn't looking at the document. He was looking at the map, at the 4 marked positions that were Blackridge's current camps. If he can get enough endorsements, he can frame an incursion as enforcement rather than aggression. He won't get them, Sever said. He was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, which was his default posture in this room. Holt doesn't have that kind of pull. He's trying to manufacture legitimacy he doesn't have. He doesn't need real endorsements, Arden said. Everyone looked at her. He needs the appearance of them. He needs enough ambiguity that when he moves, the other packs feel they have a reason to stay out of it. She paused. He's done this before. 3 years ago with the Pelway contested territory, he created enough bureaucratic noise that by the time anyone untangled it, Blackridge had already taken physical possession and the legal question was moot. You watched him do this, Lace said. Not skeptically, carefully. I had very little else to do for 7 years except pay attention, Arden said. Bract was writing. Sever had uncrossed his arms again. Ronan looked down at her. How long before he moves? She thought about it. 5 days? Maybe 6. He'll want one more formal communication attempt to you first, something he can point to as evidence that he tried to resolve it peacefully. When you refuse, he'll move within 36 hours. Then we have 4 days, Ronan said. Sever. I'll have the rotation adjustments drafted by this afternoon, Sever said. He pushed off the wall and headed for the door, then stopped. He turned and looked at Arden. The Northern Relay, he said. Are you still prepared? She met his gaze. Tomorrow morning, if the weather holds. He held the look for a moment that was not unfriendly. Don't get yourself killed, he said, and left. Tam, who had been silent in the corner taking notes, looked at Lace with an expression of barely suppressed amazement. Lace gave him a look that said, not now, and he redirected himself to his notebook. Ronan accompanied her himself, which was not what she'd proposed. You weren't part of the plan, she said, in the pre-dawn dark of the stable where they were preparing. I adjusted the plan, he said, checking the pack on his back with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Sever has the Eastern Perimeter deployment. I go where I'm most useful. You're the Alpha King. You shouldn't be on a 2-person reconnaissance into enemy territory. He looked at her. The pre-dawn light was thin and gray, and his amber eyes were less bright in it, but no less direct. And you shouldn't be walking on a knee that's 2 days out from a serious injury. We're both making adjustments. She held the look for a moment. There was no point arguing, She recognized the specific quality of finality in his voice. And she also recognized, privately, that having him there was something she didn't entirely object to, despite the tactical risk it represented. They went over the western approach in the dark, moving through the wetlands that bordered the marsh with the careful precision of 2 people who were very different sizes trying to keep equal time. He was better in the wilderness than she expected from a king. Unsurprising, she supposed, if she thought about it. Men who held this kind of territory didn't do it from behind desks. She led because she knew the terrain. He followed without impatience, without the need to establish dominance over the direction setting that a lesser confident person might have felt. She registered this as she registered everything. Filed, noted, held. The Martian pre-dawn had a particular quality. Silver water between black grass, the smell of cold mud and decaying vegetation, the sound of things moving in the dark that were not human and not interested in them. She navigated by landmarks she'd memorized from the compound's records. A distinctive bent tree, a collapsed old boundary marker mostly swallowed by bog grass, the angle of the horizon ridge, and the relay platform appeared out of the mist as exactly where she'd marked it. Occupied. 2 wolves, as she'd predicted, lower ranked and lightly armed. Their attention was on the eastern road, where Blackridge's main camps were, and on the ridge path behind them. Not on the western approach through the marsh. She and Ronan crouched in the bog grass 15 feet from the platform edge. He was so close she could feel the warmth of him against her shoulder. Left one first, he said, barely audible. I know, she said, equally quiet. They moved on a count. It was not elegant. Combat at close quarters in pre-dawn darkness in a bog rarely was. But it was fast. Ronan was extraordinarily fast for his size. The kind of fast that had obviously been cultivated over years of serious practice. And it was effective. And when it was over, both relay operators were unconscious and zip-tied with the cords from their own communications equipment, left on the platform in a condition that was recoverable when someone found them. She stood in the aftermath, breathing steadily and looking at the relay equipment, which was a specific type she recognized from Blackridge's compound. "I can modify this," she said. "Make it appear functional while routing communications to a dead channel." Ronan was already looking at her hands. "You know the system?" "I maintained it for 2 years when the regular operator was ill. Caswick thought it was beneath his attention." She was already pulling the casing panels. "Give me 15 minutes." He stood watch. She worked. The 15 minutes passed in silence, broken only by marsh sounds and the soft noise of her hands in the equipment. The bond, the thing they hadn't named yet, the thread that had been pulling taut between them since the gathering grounds, was an active presence in the enclosed space, neither of them acknowledging it, and both of them aware of it the way you were aware of a fire in a room you were pretending was cold. "Arden," he said at the 12-minute mark. She looked up from the relay casing. "After this," he said. He stopped. She waited. "After this is over," he said more carefully, there's something I want to talk about. Not the tactical situation. Not Blackridge." He paused. "The bond. What it means. I don't want to push that conversation into whenever the emergency resolves, because in my experience, emergencies have a way of being permanent if you let them." She looked at him for a moment. The mist moved around them. The gray was lightening toward dawn. "After this," she said. "Yes." Something in his expression shifted with that single syllable, fractionally, quietly, the way very contained things shift when given even a small amount of permission. She went back to the relay casing. 2 more minutes. She was reconnecting the final routing wire when she heard it. Not from the east, from the south. A sound that didn't belong in a pre-dawn marsh, the specific resonance of a wolf pack moving through forest cover. Too many bodies to move silently, even with training, carrying equipment, and the heat smell of readied fighters. She was on her feet before she fully processed the decision to stand. "That's not a patrol," she said. Ronan was already looking south, his eyes burning amber in the growing light. "No," he said. "That's an assault column." "Yes." He was very still for precisely 1 second, calculating. Then, "They moved early." The timeline she'd given had been wrong. Not by days. By days. 3 days off. She'd miscalculated, or Drace Holt had deviated from his own established pattern, which was possible. She should have weighted that possibility higher. She should have— "Stop," Ronan said. She looked at him. "You can recalibrate later," he said. "Right now I need you to move." He was already on his communications channel, his voice dropping to the clipped, rapid shorthand of a commander activating a response. She heard Saver's voice through the receiver, equally clipped, and then a cascade of other voices. The fortress response tree coming to life. The pack mobilizing from sleep to ready in the disciplined fashion of people who had drilled for exactly this. The assault column was getting louder. She looked south. She looked at the relay equipment she'd just modified. She looked at Ronan, who was still transmitting, and in a rapid flash of calculation that felt less like thought and more like her entire 7 years of accumulated intelligence arriving at once as a single answer, she understood something. "The relay," she said, cutting through his transmission. "Ronan, they don't know I modified it. They're going to try to use it to coordinate when they hit your perimeter. If I reroute the dead channel output to a frequency your people monitor—" He stopped transmitting, looked at her. The amber eyes moved fast across the implications. "How long?" 4 minutes. He looked south. The column was 3, maybe 4 minutes out. 4 minutes, he said. "Then we run." She dropped back to the relay casing. Her hands were completely steady. She had learned, over years of carrying other people's pain, that panic was a luxury that consumed resources she couldn't spare. The wire configuration in her hands was familiar. She'd worked this system for 2 years in another life, for people who saw it as another form of control. Now she was turning it against them. She finished the reroute, sealed the casing back into place. Stood. Ronan was already at her side. His hand was at her elbow. Not grasping, just present. The touch of someone who understood that proximity mattered without needing to make it a statement about ownership. "South is closed," he said. "We move west through the upper bog line, curve north, rejoin at the Harrow Ridge crossing. You know it? I know it. They moved. Behind them, as the first gray-gold light of actual dawn broke across the marsh and the Black Ridge assault column emerged from the southern tree line toward a relay station that appeared perfectly functional and completely unguarded, the war that had been building for 3 years finally stopped being a war that was coming. It had arrived. And somewhere in the Draegor fortress, 63 wolves were waking up ready, because a girl who had spent 7 years being called property had turned her captor's own tools against them in the last 4 minutes before everything caught fire. The run through the upper bog took 11 minutes. They were the 11 longest minutes of Arden's life since the 3 days she'd spent running through the storm, and in some ways they were worse, because this time she knew exactly what was behind her, and she knew what was waiting ahead. And the gap between those two knowns was filled with the specific terrible clarity of someone who had miscalculated and was now watching the consequences unfold in real time. She ran. Ronan ran beside her, matching her pace with the controlled ease of someone calibrating to a partner, and she was aware enough even through the urgency to register that he wasn't running ahead of her, wasn't pulling ahead and trusting her to keep up. He was beside her, tracking her, the way you ran with someone you weren't willing to leave behind. She filed it. Even now, she filed it. The upper bog gave way to firmer ground at the northwest edge, where the marsh grass thinned and the tree line of the Harrow Ridge began. Ronan's communication channel had been running continuously since the relay station, a low, rapid current of information that she was parsing with one part of her brain while the rest handled navigation. What she was hearing was not reassuring. The assault column from the south was the main thrust, but not the only one. Blackridge had also pushed a secondary force along the eastern boundary. Smaller, faster, composed of what Seaver was describing in terse shorthand as skirmish runners, wolves designed to harass and probe rather than hold ground. A third element, which nobody had anticipated, was approaching the northern passage that connected Draegor territory to the wider borderlands. 3-point assault. Not Blackridge's standard operational pattern, not the two-axis approach their historical engagements suggested. She had been wrong about the timeline. She was now afraid she'd also been wrong about the strategy. Sever, she said, reaching for Ronan's communication line as they broke into the tree cover. He extended it to her without question. Sever, the northern passage. How many? A half-second delay. Estimate 15 to 20, light arms moving fast. They're not trying to hold the passage, she said. They're trying to push through it and come at the fortress from behind while the main column holds your attention at the perimeter. A longer pause. Then Seaver's voice, stripped entirely of the skepticism he'd carried through most of the past week. How confident? 70%, maybe more. She was moving through the tree line now, reading the ground. The northern passage comes out behind your granary and your armory. If they breach it with your main force engaged at the perimeter, they don't need to win the front engagement, Sever said, and she could hear him already moving, already redirecting. They just need to hold it long enough to gut us from behind. Yes, a burst of rapid commands from Seaver's end, then, I'm pulling Tam's unit and redirecting north. What's your position? Harrow Ridge crossing in 4 minutes, Ronan said, taking the line back. Hold the inner perimeter until we're inside the wall. Copy that. A pause that carried something in it. Sever wasn't a man given to verbal acknowledgement, but what came next was as close as he apparently got. The girl was right about the relay modification. We're already pulling their communications. They don't know it yet. Ronan ended the transmission and looked at her sideways as they ran. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Right about one thing, wrong about the approach timing, catastrophically uncertain about what the next 3 hours held. The ledger of those 3 facts was still being calculated. They came over the Harrow Ridge in the gray-gold morning light and saw the fortress below them, the great stone structure of Draegor's stronghold already in the organized motion of a pack preparing to receive an attack, figures moving on the walls, the main gate cycling through the controlled close and verify that Seaver's drills demanded, the particular sound of a prepared fighting force that was not panicking but was very much ready. And beyond the eastern tree line, barely visible through the forest canopy, the forward edge of the Blackridge main column, moving with the unhurried pace of people who believed they controlled the terms of what was about to happen. Arden and Ronan came down the ridge at a run and crossed the last 200 yards of open ground to the fortress gate in the kind of focused, all-in sprint that left no room for strategic thinking. Only forward, only fast, only the gate, which opened for them and closed behind them with the solid finality of 2 tons of iron-reinforced oak engaging its locks. Inside the wall, the fortress had transformed. She had seen, over the past week, the Draegor pack in its peacetime configuration. Organized, competent, going about the layered work of a functional community. What she saw now was the same people reconfigured around a different purpose, and the difference was stark in the way that a river in normal flow was starkly different from the same river in flood. The banks were the same. The water was something else entirely. Ren was moving through the main courtyard with 3 assistants, establishing a field treatment station in the sheltered corner near the inner wall. Lays was at the northeast watchtower, relaying position reports downward to runners who distributed them to the 4 squad captains deployed around the perimeter. Bracht was at a map table under the covered walkway, and he looked up when Ronan came through the gate and gave a single nod that communicated an entire situation report in compressed form. Tam's unit was already gone. She caught the movement at the edge of her vision, 20 wolves moving at speed toward the northern passage. Tam running with them with an expression that was young and completely serious and entirely without the fascination she'd seen on his face in the tactical room. The situation had become real, and he had become real inside it. Ronan went straight to Brack. She almost followed, then she stopped and thought and went to Ren instead. "What do you need from me?" she said. Ren looked at her. The healer's assessment was quick and professional. "Your ribs are managed. What do you need?" A pause, then, "I need someone who can work under pressure without losing their head. The assistants are good, but they're young." She handed Arden a kit, clean, organized, heavy. "You've treated your own wounds before." "Yes." "Then you know enough. Stay with me until—" "No," Arden said. Ren stopped. "I'll come back to you," Arden said. "But right now there is something I need to do first." She looked at the field station, at the cleared space where the injured would be brought, and felt the familiar pull of her ability like a current moving under still water. "When the wounded start coming in, save the worst ones for me. The ones you can't stabilize. The ones who are going to be lost." Ren stared at her. "Your ability?" "Yes. Arden, if you absorb—" "Save the worst ones for me," she said again. "Please." Ren's mouth was a tight line. She was running calculations that Arden recognized, the ethical geometry of a healer confronting a tool that worked at the cost of the wielder. "Come back to me whole," Ren said finally. "That's the condition." Arden didn't promise. She moved. She found a position on the inner wall walk that gave her a clear sightline to 3 of the 4 engagement points without putting her in the direct line of anything coming over the outer wall, and she watched the first 20 minutes of the battle with the concentrated attention of someone trying to revise a model in real time. What she saw confirmed her revised read on the strategy and added new information she didn't like. The main Blackridge column hit the eastern perimeter with disciplined, sustained pressure. Not a charge, not a flood, but a grinding push designed to occupy and contain rather than break through quickly. They were absorbing losses without adjusting tactics, which meant the losses were calculated, acceptable, part of a plan that didn't require the eastern push to succeed. The skirmish runners along the southern fence were faster and more chaotic. They were drawing Seaver's attention and resources, pulling his response south even as the main column pushed east, creating exactly the bifurcated attention that the Northern Passage approach was designed to exploit. And the Northern Passage. She couldn't see it from her position. She could hear it, faintly. The specific sound signature of a close-quarters engagement in a confined space, which was different from open-field battle in ways that her brain categorized automatically from some combination of instinct and 7 years of listening to fighters describe what various kinds of violence sounded like. Tam was in there. 20 wolves against 15 to 20. The numbers were close enough that outcomes were genuinely uncertain. She was watching the eastern perimeter when she saw Ronan. He was at the base of the inner wall, directing the reinforcement of a weakening section of defenders at the northeast corner, and he was doing what commanders did in sustained engagements, moving constantly, reading the line, pushing resources to where the pressure was highest. He was very good at it. She could see the effect of his presence in the behavior of the wolves around him, not just the authority response of pack hierarchy, but something more immediate, the specific uplift that came from people believing the person leading them understood the situation fully and was making good decisions. She was watching him move toward the northeast corner when the Blackridge fighter came over the east wall. He was not supposed to get over the east wall. The east wall was defended and the defenders were holding, but this one had gone up a section of wall that was between two defended positions, in a gap that was 8 feet wide and not nothing, and he'd come over fast and alone and dropped into the inner courtyard 20 feet from where Ronan was standing with his back partially turned. The warning shout from the wall walk came a half second after the man landed. She was already moving. She couldn't have explained the decision in real time because it didn't feel like a decision. It felt like physics, like the shortest distance between 2 points. And the 2 points were Ronan's back and the blade that the Blackridge fighter was pulling from his belt as he oriented himself and found his target. She hit the fighter from the side, which had several disadvantages. She was lighter than him by 60 pounds at minimum. Her knee sent a white spike of protest through her whole right leg on impact, and she hadn't had time to acquire a weapon. She also had the advantage of complete surprise, because no one on either side of a territorial war expected a woman in healer's kit to come out of nowhere and put her full body weight into a collision. They went down together. It was not elegant. The blade got her, across the left forearm, not deep, the kind of cut that was painful and bloody, and ultimately not serious, but it was her left arm, and she felt it immediately. She got 2 elbows to the ribs, which made the not fully healed ones scream. She also got a grip on his blade hand and held it, which was the most important thing, because the alternative was the blade finding something more important than her forearm. Then Ronan was there, and it was over very quickly. He pulled her up from the ground in one motion, and the amber of his eyes was not controlled or measured or the contained thing she'd seen at dinner by the fire. It was wide open, burning with a fury that had nothing strategic in it. That was a significant lapse in self-preservation, he said. His voice was not calm. It worked, she said. His jaw was tight enough that she could see the muscle in it. His hands were on her shoulders, both of them, which was more contact than they'd ever made deliberately, outside of movement and necessity. She was very aware of his hands. Your arm, he said. It's not serious. Arden? Ronan. She met his eyes directly. The northeast corner is losing ground. Whatever you were doing 30 seconds ago, go do it. I'll go to Ren. The amber held her for a moment that was too long for a battlefield and exactly the right length for something else. Ren, he said. Now. Yes, she said. And then, because it needed to be said, and she didn't know what the next hour held, go. They need you more than I do right now. He moved. She watched him go for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and went to Ren. The first seriously wounded wolf came in 20 minutes into the engagement. His name was Corvin. She learned this because Ren said it, repeating it while she worked. The healer's habit of keeping the injured anchored in their own identity. Corvin was one of Seaver's Southern Patrol captains, a wide-shouldered, blunt-featured man who had been caught in a coordinated press by 3 Heron Reach skirmishers who'd gotten inside his guard and done damage that Ren assessed in clinical terse terms that translated plainly as not going to survive the next 2 hours without intervention she couldn't provide. The wound was internal. A puncture along the left side of his torso that had hit something important and was bleeding somewhere she couldn't reach. She looked at Arden. Arden was already kneeling beside Corvin. Tell me what you need me to take, she said. Ren shook her head fractionally. Not refusal, but the instinctive recoil of someone who understood cost. The hemorrhage. If you can draw the damage back from the rupture enough to let the vessel close, is that how it works? Arden said. Mechanically? I don't know exactly how it works. I've read 2 accounts of pain bearing. Neither was specific. Ren's hands were still moving, maintaining pressure. I know you absorb pain, whether the underlying injury transfers or only the sensation. It transfers, Arden said. Not always fully, but it transfers. She placed her palm flat against Corvin's side. What happened next was not something she had ever attempted at this scale. She had drawn pain before. Individual wounds, contained injuries, the accumulated damage of training fighters who wanted to get back to function faster. She had drawn Sela's broken arm when she was 15 and hadn't known yet what she was doing. She had, over the course of 7 years, drawn more damage than she could catalog into her own body, where it had metabolized slowly and imperfectly and left its record on her skin. This was different. The hemorrhage came into her like a tide, not a polite, transferable sensation, but something that had weight and urgency and its own terrible logic. Her body received it with a full-body flinch that she controlled by sheer will, reducing it to a single sharp inhalation that she let out slowly. Her left side lit up with pain. Corvin's breathing changed. Ren's hands were moving faster now, assessing, and Arden heard something in the healer's voice that was controlled and desperate at the same time. "It's working," Ren said. "Whatever you're doing, it's working. The bleed is slowing. Keep going," Arden said through her teeth. "I can hold it." She held it. The minutes that followed were the longest she had experienced since the run through the storm, and they had a different quality. Not the external urgency of running and surviving, but the internal battle of holding something inside her body that didn't belong there, that her system was trying to reject, metabolizing it through sheer insistence, while her left side throbbed with a wound she didn't have, and Corvin's breathing gradually, grudgingly stabilized. When Ren sat back and said, "Stable what?" "He's stable," Arden withdrew her hand and became very occupied with breathing normally. Her left side was going to be deeply unpleasant for the next day, maybe 2 days. But she could function. She'd done worse. "3 more, Ren said, and her voice had stripped to its essentials. "I have 3 more I can't—" "Show me," Arden said. She worked through 4 of them. Each one cost something. The first was the worst because it was new. By the 3rd and 4th, she had developed a working method. Limited contact time, drawing only enough to stabilize rather than trying to take the entire load, trusting Ren to manage the physical remainder once the critical element was absorbed. It was less efficient. It was also sustainable. By the time she finished the 4th, the battle had shifted. She became aware of this gradually. The sound patterns changed, the rhythm of shouting and impact, and the particular resonance of pack wolves in combat, moving from the continuous, sustained note of an ongoing engagement to something more sporadic. She heard Seaver's voice from somewhere above her on the wall, giving orders that had the character of consolidation rather than holding. The Blackridge main column was pulling back, not breaking, reorganizing. There was a difference. She knew it. She stood up from the 4th wounded wolf, a woman from Lace's southern detail whose injury was stable now and whose color had returned to something workable, and looked for Ren. "What's happening?" Arden said. "The eastern push stalled," Ren said, not looking up from her work. "Sever redirected forces from the south after the skirmish runners withdrew. Something changed their calculus." A pause. Tam held the northern passage. The information settled into her with a specific weight. Tam, 19 years old, who had looked at her situation in the tactical room with barely concealed fascination, who had redirected north without hesitation when the call came. Tam had held the passage. "Casualties," she said. 3 injured, none critical." Ren looked up. "Tam's fine, before you ask." She hadn't been aware she was about to ask. Maybe she would have. She looked at her hands. The left side of her body was a sustained complaint, and her ribs had something to say about the morning's activities. And her knee was giving her a detailed account of its objections. She was upright and functional, which was what mattered. "Arden." Ren's voice had changed. "You need to sit down now. You've absorbed—" "In a minute," she said. "Where's Ronan?" Ren pointed at the northeast corner. "Last I heard—" She was already moving. But the northeast corner of the inner wall was where she found him, and what she found was not what she expected. He was standing. That was the first observation. Standing meant upright, which meant alive, which was the most important fact and the one she registered first. The second observation was Sever, crouched beside him, and the expression on Sever's face, but the face of a man who had spent 11 years seeing every kind of combat injury and who was doing the thing people did when they were trying not to show that something was more serious than they were saying. The third observation was the way Ronan was breathing. She covered the distance faster than her knee wanted. "What happened?" she said. Sever looked up at her. His face did the thing it had been doing for the past week, the revision, the adjustment of the model he carried of who she was. Northeast breach at the height of the eastern push. 3 of them got inside. Ronan took the lead. He paused. One of them had a blade coated. She went still. Coated with what? Sever's jaw tightened. We don't know yet. Bracht is analyzing, but... He glanced at Ronan. It's moving fast. Whatever it is. She looked at Ronan. He looked back at her. His expression was that specific combination of controlled and aware that she had come to recognize as his version of trying not to let what he was feeling show. His eyes were amber, but the color was fluctuating. Bright, then dim, then bright again in an irregular rhythm that was nothing like his natural steady burn. I'm fine, he said. You're not fine, she said. The battle? The eastern column is pulling back. Sever has it. She went to him, crouching down to see the wound on his left side, lower than she'd expect for a chest strike, higher than she'd expect for a gut wound. The specific location that her now extensive experience with injuries told her was a problem. How long ago? 15 minutes, Sever said. Maybe 20. 20 minutes with an unknown compound moving through his blood. His wolf metabolism was slowing it, but slowing was not stopping. She could see it, the subtle gray tinge beginning at the edges of his lips, the slight unevenness in his breathing that wasn't pain response, but something more systemic. Bracht needs more time, Sever said. If we know what it is, counteragents take time we may not have, Arden said. Ren's best guess is another hour before it reaches. An hour isn't safe, she said. An hour means it's already in his central. Arden. Ronan's hand closed around her wrist. His grip was still strong. That was something. But she could feel the slight tremor in it that wasn't the Ronan who had run through the bog with her 3 hours ago. Listen to me. She looked at him. I can feel it, he said, quietly, just between them. Sever was present, but Ronan was speaking to her specifically, in the direct way he had of cutting to what was essential. It's moving. I know what that means. He paused. You're not doing what I can see you thinking about doing. I'm going to do exactly what you can see me thinking about doing, she said. It's a poison, not a wound. You've drawn injuries. This is different. I've drawn 4 injuries in the last 2 hours, she said. I know what I'm carrying. I know what my capacity is. Arden, Ronan, she kept her voice steady. You can argue with me or you can let me work. Arguing takes time we don't have. What is your preference? His grip on her wrist tightened. Then, after a long moment in which she could see him making the specific kind of decision that went against every instinct he had, the decision to trust, it relaxed. Sever, he said, without looking away from her. My lord, Sever said, if this doesn't work, it's going to work, Arden said. Sever, Ronan said again, the command in his voice steady despite everything. You have the fortress. Sever's silence had a texture she was starting to be able to read. This silence meant, I have the fortress, and I am not moving from this spot until I see what happens next. She placed both palms against Ronan's side. She had told him it was different, drawing poison versus drawing injury. She'd said it with certainty because she needed him to let her proceed, and because the certainty was real, it was different. She knew that. What she hadn't said was that she didn't know, not fully, what drawing a compound through her own biology would do. She found out. The poison came into her like cold fire, not the specific targeted agony of a wound, but something that moved, that had direction and intent, that immediately began negotiating with her body's systems in the way that toxic compounds negotiated, with force, with a refusal to be redirected, following its own pathways regardless of what she wanted. She held on. The wolf in her chest, the presence that had been sleeping with one eye open for 22 years, came fully awake. She felt it the way she might feel a door she'd been leaning against suddenly swing open. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once. The support giving way and the space beyond it suddenly, vertiginously present. The wolf rose through her like a tide going the wrong direction, upward instead of down. filling spaces she hadn't known were empty. Her hands, flat against Ronan's side, began to shake. The poison was still coming. Her body was receiving it, and the wolf was doing something she couldn't name, not metabolizing it the way she metabolized injury, but transforming it, taking the toxic compound and burning it through a process that was generating heat she could feel in her palms and along her forearms and up through her shoulders. Ronan made a sound. She didn't look up. She couldn't look up. Whatever was happening required everything she had. Arden. His voice. Changed. Not the controlled, measured voice she knew, but something underneath it, something that belonged to the wolf of him rather than the king. Arden, you're... Don't talk, she said. Or tried to say. She wasn't sure what came out. The poison was almost gone. She could feel the absence of it in him beginning, the tide drawing back, the cold fire pulling out of his system and into her hands and through her and out the other side through a process that she had no framework for because nothing in her 7 years of pain-bearing had prepared her for this. When it was finished, she sat back. Her hands were on the stone of the wall. The ground was very solid and very present. She was aware of Seaver somewhere above her field of vision and of Ronan directly in front of her, and of the fact that every nerve ending in her body was reporting an experience that had no precedent. Then she became aware of something else. Her own hands. Specifically what they looked like. The scars were still there. They would always be there. Those were the structural record of 7 years, and nothing rewrote that. But the skin around them was doing something she had never seen it do. Something that had no explanation in any framework she'd built. It was faintly luminous. Not dramatically, not like something from a children's story. Just the faint, specific luminosity of something that was alive in a new way. Like a coal that has been banked for years suddenly finding proper air for the first time. Arden, Ronan's voice. She looked up. His color was returning. The gray at the edges of his lips receding. His breathing evening out. The amber of his eyes coming back to their steady burn. He was looking at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way she had never seen from him before. He was looking at her hands, then at her face. Then at something behind her eyes that she couldn't see, but apparently he could. "Your wolf," he said, softly, like something that required careful handling to say aloud. "Arden, your wolf is awake." She looked down at her hands again. At the luminous edged scars, at the fine tremor running through her fingers that was not weakness, but something that felt uncomfortably like power looking for direction. Sever had come to stand beside Ronan. He was looking at her with an expression that had shed every remnant of skepticism, replaced by something she'd never expected to see on the first warrior's face directed at her. Pure, undisguised awe. "What?" she started. "The poison," Ronan said. "You drew it through and burned it. Your wolf burned it." He paused. That's not pain-bearing. That's something else." "That's something else entirely," Sever said. His voice was very quiet. She looked at her hands. 22 years. 22 years of a wolf that slept with one eye open, that had never risen despite everything, despite the right age and the right biology and the absolute unambiguous presence of the ability in her blood. 22 years, and it had taken a poison moving through the body of a man she was not yet willing to lose to finally wake it. The battle sounds outside the wall had dwindled to the scattered, sporadic quality of engagements in their final stage. The Black Ridge column was pulling back. Tam had held the north. Sever had the fortress. She was sitting on the stone floor of the northeast corner with her faintly luminous hands in her lap and the wolf in her chest no longer sleeping, no longer patient, no longer waiting. It was awake. And somewhere in the residue of the poison she had drawn through her own body and burned, she could feel something else. Not pain this time, not damage, not the accumulated weight of other people's suffering that she'd spent years processing. Something new, something that felt with a terrible and exhilarating precision like capacity. Outside the fortress walls, the Black Ridge column was not broken. They had pulled back, but they hadn't broken. And she knew from 7 years of watching Drace Holt operate, from the pattern of this engagement, from the 3-axis approach that had failed only because of specific interventions at specific points, that they would come again. They would come again, and next time they would come with everything. She looked at Ronan. He was watching her with the expression she'd first seen in the gathering grounds at dawn. Not pity, not the calculation of use value, not the anxious assessment of someone waiting to see what she was worth. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like the specific recognition of a man who had been waiting without knowing it for exactly what was in front of him. Her left side ached with Corvin's stabilized hemorrhage. Her ribs protested the morning's activities. Her knee had opinions she was actively ignoring. And running through all of it, underneath the pain and the fatigue and the accumulated cost of everything this day had asked of her, was the steady, unmistakable pulse of a wolf that had finally decided the world was ready for it. She closed her hands, opened them again. The luminosity faded. It didn't vanish exactly, but subsided to something dormant rather than absent, a coal banked rather than extinguished. "They're not done," she said. "No," Ronan agreed. "They'll regroup, reorganize." She looked at her hands one more time, then at him. "And when they come back?" She paused, feeling for the right words, finding them in the new territory that had opened inside her. "I'm not going to be what they expect." Sever said nothing. He didn't need to. The expression on his face said everything he would never put into words. That the girl who had collapsed in the mud of the gathering grounds 8 days ago, beaten, feverish, scarred into a map of other people's cruelty, was no longer the primary variable in the equation he was trying to solve. She had become the equation. She became the equation. The 24 hours that followed the first engagement were the kind that compressed time, not by moving fast, but by making every minute carry the weight of several. The fortress ran on no sleep and controlled urgency, the specific metabolism of people who understood that what was coming was worse than what had already arrived, and were choosing to use the interval for preparation rather than recovery. Arden used the interval for both. Ren had opinions about this, pointed, clinical, delivered in the tone of someone who had given up on being ignored and was now focused on damage limitation. She made Arden sit, checked the absorbed injuries with careful hands, and said 3 times in 3 different framings that a body carrying 2 hemorrhage equivalents, plus the metabolic cost of burning a compound toxin through a newly awakened wolf shift, was a body that needed rest before it needed anything else. Arden agreed with all of this and slept for 4 hours, which was what she could afford. She woke at the 2nd hour past midnight and found that the fortress had not in her absence collapsed. Ronan was in the tactical room with Seaver and Bracht. She went there. Bracht had finished analyzing the compound on the blade. "It's a Heron Reach formulation," he said, when she walked in, treating her presence at the table as the established fact it had apparently become. "Old recipe. Suppresses wolf metabolism, slows the shift, makes it harder for the body to fight systemic damage. Not a killing agent by itself, but in combination with the wound location." "It was meant to slow him down during the push," Sever said. He was looking at the map rather than at Ronan, in the way of a man who had feelings about how close a thing had been and was processing them through operational focus. "Degrade his ability to command while the column pressed. If Ronan goes down mid-engagement, the pack response fractures." "They knew your command structure," Arden said. She hadn't sat down yet. She was looking at the map, at the marked positions of Blackridge's 3 assault columns and the retreat lines Bracht had tracked. They knew that degrading you specifically would have a disproportionate effect. "Intelligence," Ronan said. "Someone gave them intelligence about our internal hierarchy." "Or they inferred it," she said. "Blackridge has been watching this territory for 3 years. Drace Holt is not stupid, methodical, patient." She paused. "He's been building toward this engagement. The compound on the blade isn't an improvisation. It's a prepared solution to a specific problem he identified in advance." The room was quiet for a moment. "What else has he prepared?" Sever said. She looked at the map. "That's the question." She sat down. They worked through the night. What emerged over 6 hours of map analysis and cross-referenced intelligence was a picture that was cleaner and more troubling than the original assessment. Blackridge's 3-axis approach had not been a single battle plan. It had been a probe. A deliberate test of the Draegor response pattern, designed to generate information at the cost of acceptable losses. They'd pushed all 3 axes to the point where response committed, watched how the defense distributed, and then pulled back before the commitment became decisive. "They know where we're thin," Seaver said. "They know where you were thin yesterday," Arden corrected. "They don't know what you changed overnight." "Which we changed because you identified the Northern Passage approach," Lace said. She'd joined them at the 3rd hour, pulling a chair to the table with the manner of someone who had stopped waiting for an invitation. "Which means they'll adjust again," Brack said. "Second engagement, they'll expect modified defense. They'll probe differently." "How long until they move?" Ronan asked. He was looking at Arden. 36 to 48 hours, she said. "The probe costs them. They'll want to consolidate the Heron Reach reinforcements, redistribute after casualties, let the command structure settle. Drace doesn't move again until he believes he has decisive advantage." She paused. "He thinks he still has it. He lost the first probe, but he got what he wanted from it." "Does he know about your wolf?" Tam asked. He'd arrived at the 5th hour, still carrying the particular quietly shaken quality of someone who had held a defensive position at very close quarters for the first time and was metabolizing what that had felt like. But he'd arrived, and he'd sat down, and he was asking the right questions. Everyone looked at him, then at Arden. "No," she said. "Nobody outside this room and Wren knows what happened at the northeast corner. And Drace Holt's intelligence told him I was a pain bearer with a dormant wolf, a liability in a fight, tactically." She held Tam's gaze. "He built his plan around a version of me that stopped being accurate about 18 hours ago." Tam nodded slowly, and there was something in his expression that was close to the fascination she'd seen in the tactical room a week ago, but tempered now, made serious by what yesterday had cost. "Then we don't correct him," Ronan said. "No," she agreed. "We don't correct him until it's too late to matter." Sever leaned back in his chair. He looked at her with the expression that had been evolving for a week. The expression that had moved from active skepticism through reluctant respect and seemed to be arriving somewhere she hadn't expected from him. "You're proposing we use your changed capacity as a tactical variable," he said. "Hold it until the second engagement and deploy it as a surprise. I'm proposing that what Drace Holt knows about me is a weapon we only get to use once," she said, "and that the second engagement, when he comes with everything, is the right time to use it." A pause. "There's a problem with that," Seaver said. "What problem?" "We don't know what your changed capacity actually is," he said. "We know you burned a toxin through an awakened wolf shift. We know something happened. We don't know what you can do with it, how to deploy it, whether it can be sustained or whether it was a single crisis response that won't replicate." He paused. "With respect, we're considering building a tactical plan around an unknown variable." He wasn't wrong. She had known he wasn't wrong from the moment she'd formed the thought. She had also known the answer. "Then I need today," she said. "Give me today to find out what I can do." Ronan looked at her. "You need rest." "I need to know what I am," she said. Not loudly, but with the kind of precision that stopped argument. "Before it comes again, before I'm standing in the middle of a second engagement carrying something I don't understand, I need to know what I'm carrying." The amber eyes held hers across the map table. "Today," he said, "Wren monitors. If she says stop, you stop." "Agreed." "And you eat first," he said, "properly, before you do anything else." The room, Sever, Lace, Brack, Tam, was very quiet in the specific way that people were quiet when they were pretending not to notice something. She looked at him steadily. "Fine. I'll hold you to that," he said, and returned his attention to the map, and Lace made a small sound that she converted smoothly into a cough. The eastern courtyard in mid-morning was empty except for Wren, who had agreed to the session with the expression of someone agreeing to something under protest and intending to demonstrate the protest through extreme thoroughness. The first thing Arden did was stand in the courtyard and try to reach the wolf. It didn't come immediately. She'd half expected it to. The awakening at the northeast corner had felt like a door swinging open, and she'd assumed, naively, that open doors stayed open. What she found instead was that the wolf was there, present, aware, the one-eye-open presence transformed into something fully conscious and attending, but that the shift itself was not as simple as choosing it. She stood for 20 minutes working at it, the way you worked at a knot in a rope, patiently, trying different angles, understanding the structure of the resistance rather than fighting it. What she found was that the wolf responded to something specific. It responded to pain, not self-inflicted pain. She tried that instinctively, and the wolf didn't stir. But when she reached into the stored damage she was carrying, Corvin's hemorrhage residue, the blade wound on her arm, the collected cost of yesterday absorbed and not yet fully processed, when she found those places and held them deliberately, rather than managing them at arm's length, the wolf rose toward them. The wolf came up through pain the way a seed came up through soil. It needed the resistance. It needed something to push against. She understood it with the same clarity with which she'd understood the relay equipment. Not because someone explained it, but because she'd spent 22 years paying close attention to the mechanics of things that seemed arbitrary and finding the underlying logic. She'd been told her dormant wolf was a defect, a failure, evidence of corruption in her gift. What she was understanding, standing in the eastern courtyard with Wren watching and the coal light of her ability warming her palms, was that the wolf had never been dormant because of defect. It had been waiting for the pain to be sufficient. It had been accumulating, 7 years of absorbed suffering, cataloged in her body, stored in the architecture of her scars, building toward a threshold that a standard wolf-blooded life might never have reached. She had not been broken. She had been loading. She held the pain deliberately. All of it, at once, everything she was carrying, Corvin's near death, the blade wound, the poison's residue, and underneath all of it the deeper, older layer, the 7 years of Blackridge damage that had never fully cleared, that she'd metabolized imperfectly and integrated into her biology because there had been no other option. The wolf came up through all of it like something that had been waiting for exactly this. The shift hit her like a wave, a full-body transformation that was the most painful and the most extraordinary thing she had ever experienced, which was a significant benchmark given her history. It was not graceful. She went down on one knee, then both knees, her hands hitting the courtyard stone, and then her hands were not hands in the way she was used to thinking of them. She heard Wren make a sound. She was up, on 4 legs, which was different from 2 in ways that her brain was processing with the chaotic speed of something downloading an entirely new operating system in seconds. The courtyard smelled completely different. Every surface had information she'd never had access to before. The wolf's senses were an entirely different relationship with the physical world, and the world she'd spent 22 years navigating suddenly had 20 times the data. She held it for 4 minutes before the shift reversed. Not a failure, just the natural limitation of a first full shift, the muscle memory of a new form needing practice to sustain. She came back to 2 legs on the courtyard stone, breathing hard, on her hands and knees, and the luminosity was back on her skin, brighter than it had been at the northeast corner. Wren was beside her. "Are you?" "I'm fine," Arden said. Her voice sounded different to her own ears, lower, more settled. Yes, I'm fine. That was a full shift. Yes. First full shift. Yes. A pause. Arden, a first full shift is normally, wolves spend months learning to hold it, learning to come back. I know. She was sitting back on her heels now, looking at her hands. The luminosity was fading to its banked state. I think the stored pain is accelerating it. Everything I've absorbed over the years, it's fuel. The wolf is burning it. Wren was quiet for a long moment. "You've been storing suffering for 7 years," she said carefully, "and now your wolf is converting it," Arden said. "Yes." Another silence. Then, in a voice that had something in it Wren rarely let surface, "Those people did a great deal of damage to you." "They did," Arden said, "and now the damage is becoming something else," she said. She looked at the courtyard wall. Beyond it, somewhere to the east, Blackridge was regrouping. Drace Holt was making plans based on information about her that was no longer accurate. "Yes." She stood up. "Again," she said. She shifted 4 more times before noon. By the 4th, the sustain had extended to 11 minutes, and the return was controlled. A deliberate choice rather than a collapse. Wren monitored in silence that evolved from anxious to careful, to something that looked, by the fourth shift, like the focused attention of a professional witness to something she would be thinking about for a long time. The ability worked in the shifted form too. That was the discovery that changed everything. She found it on the third shift, reaching for the pain-bearing instinctively when a training wolf in the adjacent yard yelped from a sprained leg, and finding that in the shifted form, the ability was not the same contained draw of her human form. It was amplified. The wolf received and transformed damage not as a passive absorption, but as an active process, taking in, burning through, releasing. The release was new. She stood in the courtyard in shifted form and held a handful of pain she'd drawn from a training session injury. Minor, inconsequential, and then deliberately, carefully, with the attention of someone learning a new language by speaking it for the first time, let it back out. Not into herself. Out. The released energy hit the stone wall at the courtyard's edge and left a mark. A scorch, precise and 2 feet wide, still smoking faintly when she shifted back and stood looking at it. Ren stood beside her, looking at the mark. "That's new," Ren said. "Yes," Arden agreed. "How much could you release, hypothetically?" She thought about 7 years of stored damage, the full weight of everything she'd absorbed and processed imperfectly and carried in her biology. The architecture of her scars, each one a record. "I don't know," she said honestly. "A great deal more than that." Ren looked at her. "Arden, I know," she said. "I know what you're going to say. Or releasing stored pain on that scale, we have no idea what that does to the body carrying it. I know. It could. I know." She looked at the scorch mark. "But Drace Holt is coming with everything he has. And everything he has is based on a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. And the people in this fortress have bled for 8 days because of what Blackridge did to me. And I—" She stopped, steadied herself. "I am not going to be a passenger in what comes next." Ren was quiet for a long time. "Then you'd better be able to control it," she said finally, "because releasing something you can't aim is worse than not releasing it at all." "Then that's what we work on this afternoon," Arden said. She was in the Western training yard at the 3rd hour of the afternoon when Seaver found her. She was practicing the release with the disciplined repetitiveness of someone who had identified a skill gap and was closing it without sentiment. Drawing minor stored pain, releasing it in controlled bursts at a sequence of marked stone targets, adjusting the aperture of the release each time, learning the mechanics through iteration. The marks on the stones were getting more precise. The effort each release cost was decreasing. Sever watched for approximately 3 minutes before he spoke. "You're aiming it," he said. "I'm learning to aim it," she said. "There's a difference." He moved to stand beside her, looking at the marked stones. The expression on his face was the one she'd come to recognize as his version of active recalibration. The face of a man whose model of a situation was being revised against his will and who was disciplined enough to let the revision happen. "What's the range?" he said. "At full release?" "I don't know. I haven't tested full release." She released another controlled burst at the farthest stone, 20 feet. The mark appeared, precise and contained. Controlled partial release, 20 feet with accuracy. More distance with less control. In shifted form? Further. The wolf amplifies it. He was quiet for a moment. She released again. Another mark. "You know what you're describing," he said. "You understand what you're telling me you can do. I understand that it requires the second engagement to not go the way Drace Holt is planning," she said, "and that to ensure that, I need to be positioned specifically, and the deployment needs to be timed and it needs to be built into the defensive plan rather than improvised." She lowered her hands and looked at him directly. "Which is your area, not mine." He looked at her for a moment that held, she thought, the final revision. The completion of a process that had been running since the corridor 7 days ago. Since she'd told him to ask Ronan, and he'd said fair enough and moved past her. The long arc of a skeptical man arriving, through evidence, at a different conclusion. "Come back to the tactical room at the 5th hour," he said. "We'll build it around you." She nodded. He turned to go, then stopped and turned back and said something she didn't expect from him. "For what it's worth," And I know it's late to say it. You were right to come here, even with everything it cost us." He paused. "Blackridge has been a slow rot at our eastern boundary for 3 years. This forced the confrontation. You forced the confrontation." Another pause. "And it turns out the person who forced it is—" He appeared to be searching for the right word, which was unusual for a man who normally deployed language with the efficiency of someone who'd decided words were a resource to be conserved. "Not what I initially assessed." She held his gaze. "No," she said, "I'm not." He left. She turned back to the stones and released again, controlled, precise, slightly further than the last time. The plan they built that afternoon was the most complex thing Arden had ever been part of constructing. Bracht drove the architecture because Bracht understood how defensive positions and offensive responses could be layered into something that appeared reactive from the outside and was actually a designed sequence. Sever provided the operational specifics, which units, which positions, the timing of transitions between defensive and offensive postures. Lays added the southern flank intelligence. Tam, who had earned his seat at the table by holding the northern passage against worse odds than anyone had expected, contributed the specific knowledge of what had worked in confined space engagement at the passage. Arden contributed herself. Her positioning in the plan was unusual. Not on the wall. Walls were defensive, static, and what she was proposing was neither. Not with Sever's combat units, because she wasn't a trained fighter in the conventional sense, and mixing her into a formed fighting unit created coordination complexity that reduced rather than enhanced. She was, in the language of the plan, a reserve element. Held back through the initial engagement while the standard defense absorbed the Blackridge push, positioned at the center of the formation where she could see all 4 axes of potential attack. Released at the point Bracht identified as the moment of maximum Blackridge commitment. The point past which their assault would be fully invested and unable to restructure quickly. At that point, she would be what she'd practiced being for a day. Ronan had been present for the planning session but had said less than usual. He spoke to operational questions when asked, made 2 decisive calls on resource allocation that everyone accepted without debate, and kept his attention on the map rather than on her, which was a choice she noted. When the session ended, he walked beside her through the corridor back toward the main hall. "You're not going to tell me it's too much," she said. "No," he said. "Or that you'd rather keep me in the fortress during the engagement." "No." "Or that the plan is, Arden." He stopped walking. She stopped with him. The corridor was empty. "I've watched you for 8 days," he said. "I watched you cross a boundary marker that most wolves won't cross. I watched you work through 4 critical injuries in a medical station while we were in active combat. I watched you shift for the first time at 22 years old and come back controlled." He paused. "I would not be respecting what I've watched if I told you any of those things." She looked at him. The amber of his eyes was steady and warm in the torchlit corridor. The controlled flame, always present, a constant she'd begun to organize herself around without fully acknowledging it. "You're afraid it'll go wrong," she said, not accusing, understanding. "I am," he said, simply. "That's mine to carry." "It might go wrong," she said. "Things do." "I know. But the plan is good, and I'm as ready as a day of practice can make me." She paused. "And Blackridge is not going to stop coming, not while Drace Holt is breathing and believes I'm his to reclaim." She held his gaze. "This ends it. That's worth the risk." He was quiet for a moment. "After," he said. She knew what he meant. They'd said it before. The after this conversation, the bond, the thing between them that had been held in suspension since the first morning because emergencies didn't actually wait for resolution. "After," she said. "Yes, I promise." Something in him settled. A specific quality of relief that was different from tactical confidence, more personal, the relief of someone who had been handed a commitment they'd been afraid to ask for. "Try not to get killed tomorrow," he said. "I'll add it to the list," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. She had cataloged every variation of that almost smile over 8 days, and this one was different from the others. Less restrained, more real, the expression of someone whose face was doing something it had decided to do rather than something it was being permitted to do. She went to her room, which still had a door that locked from the inside, and slept for 6 hours. The attack came at dawn of the second day, as predicted. It came with everything. Brack's estimate of 90 combatants had been conservative. The overnight watch counted closer to 110 as Blackridge and the Heron Reach forces moved out of their camps in the pre-dawn dark and organized themselves into an assault formation that was not the three-axis probe of the first engagement. This was a consolidated push. The full force, moving together, aimed at the eastern perimeter, with a secondary element pressing south in a coordinated hammer and anvil approach. They had learned from the first probe. They were not going to divide attention this time. They were going to hit one point with everything and break through it. Inside the fortress, 63 wolves received them. Arden stood at the center of the inner courtyard and watched the eastern wall and waited. Sever's units absorbed the initial push with the organized, grinding defense of people who had drilled for exactly this. The eastern wall held. The south held. Tam's unit, repositioned from the northern passage to reinforce the southeastern angle, held the transition between the two engaged perimeters with the efficiency of someone who had done this once before and knew what the moment felt like. 20 minutes, 30. The Blackridge force pressed. The defense held. Arden watched and counted and waited. Ren was behind her, which she'd neither requested nor argued with. The healer was simply there, a presence at her back that was its own kind of steadiness. At the 34th minute, Brack appeared at the courtyard entrance. "They've committed," he said. "All forward elements passed the commitment point." She exhaled. "Full deployment?" she said. "Full deployment," Brack confirmed, and his voice had a particular quality. The voice of someone watching a complex plan reach the moment it was designed for. She closed her eyes. She went into the stored pain the way she'd practiced, not avoiding it, not managing it at arm's length, but entering it fully. 7 years. Every absorbed wound, every piece of Blackridge-inflicted damage that had metabolized imperfectly and been integrated into her biology as the permanent cost of survival. She found it all. She held it all. The wolf came up through it like something that had been waiting for exactly this moment with the patience of a tide waiting for its moon. She shifted. The courtyard, in wolf form, was a different place, but the information density was enormous, the smell of the engagement vivid and immediate, the sound of it precise and directional. She could feel the wall ahead of her with senses she'd had for less than a day, and already trusted more than she'd expected. She could feel, past the wall, the organized mass of the Blackridge assault force, their heat, their movement, their specific pattern of committed pressure that had gone past the point of restructuring. She gathered everything she was carrying, everything 7 years had put into her, the full weight of accumulated damage, the stored suffering that had been slowly burning through her wolf since yesterday. All of it, collected, focused, the coal pulled together into something with direction and intent. She released it. Not a controlled partial burst at a training stone. Everything. It went out through the eastern wall like a pressure wave. Not fire, not impact, but something that moved through stone and earth and the organized mass of 100+ wolf assault force and carried with it the specific, unmistakable quality of suffering returned to its sources. The Blackridge wolves, who had spent years inflicting damage on others, felt, in that moment, the particular echo of it. Not punishment exactly, but recognition. The weight of what had been taken, given back all at once. The assault column broke. Not gradually. Abruptly. The way something broke when the structural element holding it together was suddenly absent. The organized push fractured at the forward edge, and the fracture moved backward through the formation with the speed of something that had been held under pressure and was now free to find its natural configuration. She came back to 2 legs in the courtyard. The luminosity on her skin was bright enough that Ren, behind her, made a sound. Her left side was very quiet. Not painful, quiet. In the way a room was quiet after something loud had passed through it. The stored damage she'd been carrying for 7 years, the accumulated weight that had lived in the architecture of her scars, it was gone, not processed slowly over days and weeks. Gone, converted entirely, released back into the world in a single-directed wave. She stood in the center of the courtyard and felt, for the first time in her adult life, that the space inside her was entirely her own. The eastern wall held. Beyond it, the battle sounds were changing, from the sustained crash of organized assault to the scattered, retreating quality of a force in disarray. She heard Seaver's voice from the wall walk, sharp and immediate, calling the pursuit. Heard the gates beginning to cycle. Heard something else, a specific quality of silence from the wall walk above her, the silence of people stopping in the middle of doing other things because they had seen something through the battle they were not going to forget. Ronan appeared at the courtyard entrance. He looked at her. She was standing in the center of the courtyard in the early morning light, luminous and quiet and no longer carrying what she'd been carrying when she woke up. His amber eyes moved over her, the same clinical but not clinical assessment she'd felt the first morning in the gathering grounds, but transformed by 8 days of everything they'd been through into something that was not assessment at all. "The column broke," he said. "Yes," she said. Yes." He crossed the courtyard in 6 strides and stopped in front of her. Closer than the careful distance they'd maintained since that first day. Close enough that she could see everything his face was doing, all the things it usually only did in partial, controlled measure. The relief, the fury at Blackridge that had not diminished and never would, the specific, unguarded quality of a man whose fear had just been converted, abruptly, into something else. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No," she said, and it was true in a way it hadn't been true for 7 years. Not hurt. He reached out and took her hand, her right hand, the one closer to him, and held it, palm up, looking at the scars that were still there and always would be. He looked at them the way she'd seen him look at them the morning she'd woken in his fortress, not with the calculated interest of someone assessing utility, and not with the uncomfortable pity of someone who didn't know where to put what they were looking at, with the specific, careful attention of someone who understood that the record carved into this skin was the reason she was standing here at all. On the wall above them, Seaver's voice was directing the pursuit response. Below the fortress walls, the remains of the Blackridge assault were retreating in the accelerating manner of a force that had not merely been repelled, but had been made to understand something about the fundamental terms of the engagement. Around them, the wolves of the Draegor pack who had seen it, who had been on the wall or in the courtyard or at the gate, were not doing the things that people in the immediate aftermath of battle usually did. They were still, looking at her. Not with the skepticism of those first days, when she'd been the unknown variable at the table, the girl who'd collapsed in the gathering grounds, the problem that had imported a war. Not with the careful management of a community that had decided to tolerate an outsider for the king's sake, with something she recognized, distantly, from the few times in her life she'd encountered it, the particular quality of people in the presence of something that had just changed the terms of their understanding. Sever appeared on the wall walk above and looked down. His eyes met hers. He nodded. A single nod, from a man who had spent 11 years keeping this pack alive, and who did not offer acknowledgement as a courtesy. She held his gaze and nodded back. Ronan's hand was still around hers. "After," he said quietly. The word between them had accumulated weight over 8 days of being deferred. She looked at him. The courtyard was full of people who were pretending not to watch them and doing a poor job of it, and the battle was not entirely over. Blackridge had retreated, not dissolved, and Drace Holt was still somewhere to the east making calculations about what had just happened. And there were 100 things still undone and uncertain and unresolved. "After starts now," she said. And in the early morning light of a courtyard that smelled of battle and cold stone and the specific charged quality of a shift in power, Ronan Draegor, Alpha King, the most feared man in the northern reaches, pulled the woman who had remade the terms of his war into the space beside him with the steady, unhurried certainty of someone who had made a decision and was done deferring it. The girl who had collapsed in the mud 8 days ago was gone. What stood in her place was something the northern reaches had not seen before, and was, as it turned out, entirely unprepared for. After starts now. She had set it in the courtyard with the battle still cooling around them, and Ronan had pulled her close with the unhurried certainty of a man done deferring and for exactly 4 minutes the world had contracted to the two of them, and the space between them that had been narrowing since the first dawn in the gathering grounds. Then Seaver had come down from the wall walk and said, with the particular diplomatic bluntness that was his primary register, Blackridge retreated to the Heron Reach camp, not back to their own territory. They're consolidating, not withdrawing. He'd paused, looked at them both with the expression of a man who had noted everything and chosen to say nothing about most of it. The after is going to have to wait another few hours. Ronan had looked at Arden. A few hours, she said. A few hours, he agreed, and they'd gone back to work. The intelligence came in over the next 6 hours in fragments that Bract assembled with the focused patience of a man constructing a mosaic from pieces delivered one at a time. What the mosaic showed, when enough pieces were in place, was not encouraging. Drace Holt had not broken. A lesser alpha might have. The assault column's collapse had been sudden and total, the kind of defeat that could fracture command authority if the alpha couldn't provide an explanation that his pack could absorb. But Drace Holt was, as Arden had always known and had said repeatedly, methodical and patient, and possessed of the specific dangerous quality of a man who processed failure as information rather than humiliation. He had told his people, according to the source Lays had inside the Heron Reach camp, that Draegor had deployed an unknown dark craft weapon. He'd framed the retreat as tactical, not failure, repositioning. He'd called for his pack's remaining forces plus the full Heron Reach complement plus, and this was the piece that changed the shape of the mosaic entirely, a third allied element that had apparently been held in reserve throughout the entire engagement. A pack called the Vorden. Arden had gone still when Bract said the name. Everyone in the room noticed. "You know them," Ronan said. "I know of them," she said carefully. "Caswick mentioned them. The potential sale he was discussing the night I decided to run. The pack he named. The one whose purpose he described." She paused. "The Vorden are not a territorial pack. They're a collection organization. They move rare gifted wolves between buyers. They trade in ability the way other packs trade in land." The room was quiet. "And Drace Holt has had them waiting," Seaver said. "Not just waiting," she said. "Positioned. He brought them as the contingency. The option for if conventional assault failed and he needed a different approach." She looked at the map. "They don't fight. They capture." "They were always coming for you," Ronan said. Not a question. "The column was never the primary plan," she said, and the clarity of it was arriving as she spoke it, the pieces reorganizing themselves into a shape she should have seen earlier and hadn't, because she'd been modeling Drace Holt's strategy on his territorial history rather than on what had actually motivated this engagement from the beginning. The assault was the distraction. The Vorden are the point. Bract was already marking new positions on the map. "They're moving," Lace said, reading a just-arrived report from the Eastern Watch. "Not from the camp, from the north." Sever looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Arden. She looked at the northern position on the map, the passage that Tam had held 2 days ago, that had been reinforced since, that was now being approached by a group whose methodology was not assault, but infiltration, whose expertise was not fighting through defenses, but finding the gaps that defenses created by being what they were. "They have someone inside," she said. The silence that followed had a specific quality. "That's a serious accusation," Sever said. His voice was flat. "I know," she said. "I'm not making it lightly." She looked at the map. "The Northern Passage holds because Tam's unit knows it, but the Vorden specialize in finding what's known and using it. If they have intelligence on the passage defense, the specific unit placement, the rotation schedule, they don't need to overwhelm it. They need one gap, 30 seconds, 2 or 3 people who know exactly where they're going." "Who knew the Northern Passage defense details?" Ronan asked. He was looking at Seaver. "The people in this room," Seaver said. "The patrol captains. Tam's unit." He paused. "Wren, because she planned the medical positioning relative to the northern exposure." "I need to go to the passage," Arden said. "Arden, I need to go to the passage because the Vorden will not stop when the conventional defense holds. They'll push until they find me, or until I find them first." She looked at Ronan. "You know I'm right." The amber eyes held hers. She could see the conflict in them. The king and the man running simultaneous calculations that were arriving at different conclusions and needed to find a resolution. "Take Seaver," he said. "I need you," she said. "Not because I can't function without you, because the bond is an active element now, and against a group that specializes in isolating targets, having the bond engaged and present is a tactical advantage." She paused. "I've thought about this." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this," he said. "For the last 2 hours," she confirmed, "while we were doing everything else." The corner of his mouth moved. "Sever takes the eastern perimeter." "Agreed," she said. Sever looked at them both with the expression of a man who had made peace with a great many things over the past 8 days and was making peace with one more. "Try not to leave me with a command vacancy," he said, which was Sever's version of come back whole, and moved to the eastern perimeter assignment without further comment. The northern passage at midday was a different space from the confined, desperate battleground of 2 days ago. The bodies had been cleared, the ground had been turned by the aftermath of close engagement, and Tam's unit had reinforced the choke points with the improvised but effective barrier construction of people who had learned the hard way where the vulnerabilities were. Tam himself met them at the passage entrance. He looked at Arden, and then at Ronan, and then back at Arden with the expression he'd been refining over 8 days. Not the wide-eyed fascination of the first tactical room session, but the focused attention of someone who had decided to learn everything he could from what was in front of him. "The watch reported movement 40 minutes ago," he said. "Stopped at the ridgeline. No advance since." "They're waiting for the rotation gap," Arden said. "What's the next rotation?" 20 minutes. "Then we have 20 minutes. She looked at the passage, the narrow, tree-lined corridor through the northern ridge that connected Draegor territory to the borderlands beyond. 50 yards of confined space, multiple angles, the specific challenge of a defensive position that worked against organized assault and was considerably less useful against 3 people who knew exactly where the defenders were and were willing to move slowly. "Where's the gap in your coverage?" Tam hesitated. Not reluctance, she thought, but the specific pause of someone who had never been asked to identify their own vulnerability out loud by the person they were trying to protect. 20 meters in, he said. "Where the passage bends east. The angle means the North Watch and the South Watch both have a blind zone about 4 meters wide for approximately 8 seconds during the rotation. We tried to eliminate it, but the terrain, it's unavoidable," she said. "I know." She looked at the passage. "That's where they'll come through." Ronan was beside her, reading the space with the same operational attention he brought to everything. "We hold the bend," he said. "We hold the bend," she confirmed, "and we let them come through it." Tam looked at her. "Let them... The Vorden won't engage unless they have acquisition advantage," she said. "They'll come through the gap because they believe it's clear, and then they'll move for a specific target. Me. If I'm visible from the bend, they'll commit." She met his eyes. "Once they commit past the bend, your units close from both ends. They're contained." "And you?" "I'm not what they expect anymore," she said. Tam looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he'd been learning to look at things in the past 48 hours. Then he nodded, with the decisive quality of someone who had assessed the risk and accepted the terms. "North unit holds position," he said, raising his communication line. "South unit, on my mark, close the bend." The Vorden came through the gap at the exact moment of the rotation. There were 4 of them, not the 2 or 3 she'd estimated, which was a revision she registered in the 2-second window between their appearance around the bend and the moment they saw her standing 20 meters in, alone, visible. They were fast. She'd expected that. Collection specialists were chosen for speed and the kind of close control ability that made capture viable against resistant targets. What they were not expecting was the wolf. She shifted before the first one closed half the distance, not the controlled practice shift of the courtyard training sessions, but the combat-fast version she'd been working toward, the one that the practice had been building to. The one that came up through the pain-stored fuel with the speed of something that had been waiting for exactly this kind of urgency. The leading Vorden specialist stopped so abruptly the one behind him collided with his back. She was not a large wolf. She'd observed this in the courtyard, comparing herself against the shifted wolves she'd seen in the pack's training exercises. She was medium, lean, built for the combination of endurance and precision rather than raw force. What she was, which none of the 4 specialists in the Northern Passage had any way of knowing because the information didn't exist yet anywhere outside of a small circle of people in the Draegor fortress, was luminous. The scars, in shifted form, ran through her coat as lighter lines, not glowing dramatically, not performing for effect, but carrying the specific, unmistakable quality of something that had been through fire and been changed by it rather than destroyed. 7 years of accumulated damage, burned through and converted, and no longer a weight, but a mark. The record of everything that had been done to her, worn on the outside. The Vorden specialist looked at her and did not move. Ronan shifted beside her. His wolf was, as advertised, large, the specific immensity of a mature alpha who had been shifting and training since adolescence, an animal that made the word wolf feel insufficient for what it was describing. He came to stand beside her, and the combined presence of them in the narrow passage had a quality that even trained specialists who trafficked in rare gifted wolves apparently found worth reconsidering. They reconsidered for approximately 2 seconds. Then Tam's units closed from both ends. It was not a battle. It was a containment, the specific controlled process of removing options until only one remained, and the remaining option was cooperation. The Vorden specialists were professionals, and professionals did the math. 4 against 2 highly motivated wolves plus 2 units of trained fighters in a 50-yard contained space was math that resolved to one answer. They came back to human form and put their hands up. She shifted back. Ronan shifted back and shifted. In the sudden quiet of the aftermath, the Northern Passage held a ringing quality, the absence of urgency, the presence of conclusion. Tam's people had the 4 specialists secured with an efficiency born of the past 2 days' hard experience. She looked at the 4 faces, controlled, professional, the specific expression of people who had accepted a changed outcome and were already calculating next steps. She recognized the type. She'd been studied by versions of these people her entire life. "Where is Drace Holt?" she said. The leading specialist looked at her. He was older than the others, silver-haired, with the particular steady eyes of someone for whom this work had long since lost whatever moral complexity it might once have carried. "That information has value," he said. "You're in a contained passage with no exit and no leverage," she said. "What it has is a cost." A pause. Something moved across his face, the recalibration of a professional assessing new information about the asset they'd been sent to acquire. "Eastern Ridge," he said. "He doesn't commit to the front. He manages from the ridge." She looked at Ronan. Ronan was already looking east. They found Drace Holt on the Eastern Ridge, not alone. He had 6 personal guards and Caswick Morn, who was in the specific condition of a man who had been relying heavily on Blackvein whiskey and was managing the morning badly. He also had Velera, his mate and co-alpha, who was standing with her arms crossed and the expression of a woman who had been told this would work and was now in the process of deciding how much of the accountability she was willing to share. Arden stood at the edge of the ridge clearing with Ronan on her left and 4 of his warriors behind her, and looked at the man who had held her chains for 7 years. Drace Holt looked back at her. He was not what people expected when they imagined a tyrant. He was moderate-sized, even-featured, with the kind of unremarkable face that made him look like someone's competent administrator. His cruelty had always been the efficient kind. Not sadistic, not personal, purely functional. He hurt people because it served a purpose, and stopped when the purpose was served and felt nothing particular about either phase. He looked at her now with the expression she'd seen him use on every problem that hadn't resolved according to plan. The face of a man updating his model and looking for the remaining options. "Arden," he said. "Drace," she said. First name. It was the first time in 7 years she'd used it to his face, and the specific quality of that small shift landed in the clearing like a stone dropped into still water. Caswick made a sound. Valera's eyes narrowed. "You've made a significant mess," Drace said. His voice was conversational. "For everyone." "You made the mess when you put your hands on someone who didn't belong to you," she said. "I'm cleaning it up." "You belong to—" "Don't," Ronan said. One word, The specific timbre that he used when he was not using volume, because volume was unnecessary, the weight of it, the absolute non-negotiable quality, carried everything that needed carrying. Drace looked at him. Two alphas, different in almost every dimension that mattered. The assessment between them was rapid and came to the same conclusion from both sides. The Vorden specialists, Drace said. In custody, Arden said. The Heron Reach. Retreating, Ronan said. Their alpha sent his withdrawal terms an hour ago. Apparently the Heron Reach leadership is reconsidering the terms of their alliance with Blackridge. He paused. People tend to reconsider terms when an engagement goes the way yesterday's went. Drace was still looking at Arden. She could see the model updating in real time, the replacement of the asset he'd held for 7 years with the thing she'd become in 8 days, and the specific, difficult process of a man who traded in power having to account for a power he had created and could no longer control. "What do you want?" he said. Direct, finally. The conversational surface stripped. She had thought about this. In the 4 hours of the previous night that she'd actually slept, and in the training yard, and in every spare moment between things, she had thought about what the answer to that question was, because she'd known it was coming, and she'd known that her answer would matter. "I want 3 things," she said. "First, formal dissolution of every claim, legal or otherwise, that Blackridge holds over me. In writing, witnessed by 3 neutral packs, registered with the Northern Reaches Council." Drace's jaw tightened. "Done. Second, the 11 wolves currently held in Blackridge's compound under the same classification they used for me. Released, unharmed, with documentation of their status and resources to establish themselves independently." Caswick said something under his breath. Drace silenced him with a look. "The compound," Drace started, "is not a negotiating point," she said. "It's a condition. Non-negotiable." A long pause. "Done," he said. "Third." She looked at him steadily. "Blackridge withdraws from the eastern boundary entirely. No reconnaissance, no camps, no resource claims within 5 miles of the Draegor boundary line. Permanent, registered." Valera uncrossed her arms. "You're dismantling 7 years of—" "Valera," Drace said quietly, and she stopped. He looked at Arden for a long moment. She looked back. She had spent 7 years reading his face, the face of the man who made decisions about her life with the detached efficiency of someone managing inventory. She had learned its every register, every tell, every small signal that preceded a particular kind of decision. What she saw now was something she had never seen from him before. Defeat. Clean, undisguised, the specific defeat of a man who had run out of moves and was intelligent enough to know it. "Done," he said. "Put it in writing," she said, today. "Before you leave this ridge, Brack will provide the documentation." Drace looked at Ronan. "You trust her terms?" "They're my terms," Ronan said. The silence that followed held everything that needed to be said between 2 alphas about who stood where and why. Drace Holt, alpha of the Blackridge pack, looked at the woman he had held in chains for 7 years. Looked at the luminous-scarred, wolf-awake, fully present woman who had crossed his border into the strongest territory in the Northern Reaches and had remade the terms of every relevant equation. And he did the thing that men like him only did when the alternative was worse. He looked away first. None. The documentation took 2 hours. Brack produced it with the meticulous thoroughness of a man who had been waiting his entire professional life for the satisfaction of writing terms that actually meant something. 3 neutral pack witnesses were summoned from the borderland contacts that Ronan maintained for exactly this kind of necessity. The Heron Reach Alpha, who had already sent withdrawal terms and was in a mood to demonstrate cooperative distance from Blackridge, agreed to serve as a 4th witness. Caswick Morn signed with the expression of a man who was thinking about his whiskey. Valera signed with the expression of a woman recalculating her next decade. Drace Holt signed last, and when his pen lifted from the page, Arden felt something move through her that she hadn't anticipated. Not triumph, exactly. Not relief, though relief was part of it. Something larger and quieter. The feeling of a weight that had been so long present, she'd integrated it into her sense of normal. Finally, completely, lifting. She watched Drace Holt's guards escort him down the ridge and into the tree line and out of her sight line. Ronan was beside her. He didn't say anything. He understood, she thought, that this was a moment that needed to be inhabited rather than filled. She stood on the eastern ridge of Draegor territory and watched the last of the Black Ridge contingent disappear into the forest, and she breathed. Os. The pack gathering happened 3 days later. It was not her idea, and Ronan had presented it to her with the specific careful quality he used when he was proposing something he thought she might resist. The pack needs to understand what happened, he said. Not just the tactical version, the full version. She had looked at him. You mean they need to understand what I am? They need to understand who you are, he said. There's a difference. She thought about standing in a room full of people who had spent a week adjusting their model of her, who had watched her shift in a courtyard and hold a line and break an assault and negotiate terms on a ridge. She thought about being the subject of a formal gathering, the exposure of it, the specific vulnerability of being seen fully by a community whose opinion of her had been, until very recently, at best uncertain. All right, she said. He looked at her with the expression that meant he'd expected more resistance and was slightly thrown by its absence. All right, she said again. They deserve to know, and she paused. I think I need to say it out loud, in front of people. What happened, what I am. She looked at him. 7 years of having that used against me, and then 8 days of it becoming something else. I think saying it in front of witnesses makes it real in a different way. He nodded. There's something else I want to do at the gathering, he said. I know, she said. He looked at her. I know, she said again. I've known for 3 days what you were building toward. I just wanted you to say it. The expression on his face was, for the first time since she'd known him, fully unguarded. No controlled surface, no managed register, just the actual face of the man underneath all the kingship and the strategy and the contained fury he kept on a steady leash. Will you let me? He said. She looked at him for a long moment, at the amber eyes, steady and warm, at the man who had crouched in the mud of his own gathering grounds at dawn, and looked at her without calculation, who had stood between her and the people who called her property and said not here, without hesitation, without knowing yet what she was or what it would cost him. Yes, she said, simply. The gathering was held in the great hall of the fortress. All 63 wolves of the Draegor pack, plus the neutral witnesses who had remained after the documentation, plus Ren and Bract and Lace and Tam and Savor, who had arranged themselves along the hall's right wall with the particular quality of people who were witnessing something they intended to remember precisely. Ronan spoke first. He gave the tactical account, the assault, the defense, the breach, the poison, the second engagement, the Vorden, the ridge. He told it without embellishment and without the instinct for self-aggrandizement that lesser men brought to victory accounts. He told it as it had happened. Then he said, none of this ends as it does without Arden Vale. The tactical intelligence, the relay modification, the Northern Passage identification, the second engagement, the terms on the ridge, every critical intervention came from her. I want the pack to understand that clearly and without ambiguity. She stood to his left and looked at 63 faces that were looking back at her. She found, in the looking, that it was not what she had feared. It was not the uniform, skeptical assessment of the first days. It was not the careful management of a community tolerating a disruption for the alpha's sake. It was 63 people who had bled alongside her and seen what she'd done and were in the process of making a decision about what that meant. Then it was her turn to speak. She had prepared nothing. She had thought about it and decided that preparation would make it a performance, and a performance was not what this needed to be. She told them the truth. Not the tactical version, the full version. 7 years of being called property, the ability she'd been born with and what had been done with it, the 3 days of running, the gathering grounds at dawn, the week inside their walls where she'd been figuring out whether trust was something she could afford, the northeast corner and the poison and the wolf coming awake, and what it had felt like to finally understand what she'd been carrying and why. She told them about releasing it, the full weight of 7 years of stored damage, converted and directed. She told them that she was not the same person who had collapsed in the mud of their gathering grounds, and that she would not pretend to be, and that what she was instead was something she was still learning and intended to keep learning in this territory if they would have her. The hall was completely silent. She stopped speaking. In the silence, Tam, 19 years old, who had held the northern passage and who had, she suspected, more of the future of this pack in him than anyone yet fully appreciated, started to say something. The word didn't fully form. What came out instead was something inarticulate and complete, and he put his hands together, and then Lyse did, and then the hall was doing what halls did when something that needed acknowledging got acknowledged. She stood in it and let herself be seen. Ronan waited for it to settle. Then he looked at her, and she looked at him, and he said, in the carrying voice of a man who was used to his words mattering, "I'm asking the pack to witness a bond claim." The hall stilled again, differently this time, the specific charged quiet of a community present for something that changed the fundamental composition of their structure. He turned to her, fully, in front of everyone. She had been waiting for this and had not been waiting for it, had known it was coming and still felt, when it arrived, the specific impact of something real that all the anticipation in the world didn't fully cushion. "Arden Vale," he said, "you crossed my boundary line with 3 days of running behind you and every reason to believe what was waiting was worse than what you'd left. You sat at my tactical table and gave me 7 years of knowledge you'd collected when knowledge was the only thing they couldn't take. You held Corvin and 3 others in a medical station while a battle ran over your head. You went into the bog with me in the dark, and you modified the relay, and you shifted for the first time in 22 years in my courtyard, and you broke 100 wolf assault with your bare hands." He paused. "With everything they put into you." She held his gaze. "I have known you for 11 days, he said. "I have not known anyone else in the way I know you. And my wolf has had no uncertainty from the first moment, which I find, given how certain of most things I am, to be the most trustworthy evidence I have." Seaver, along the right wall, had his arms crossed and his eyes forward, and the expression of a man who had made his peace with this particular development approximately 5 days ago and was now simply present for the formality. "I claim you as mate," Ronan said. "If you'll have me." She looked at him. She had spent 7 years in a compound that called her property. She had learned to lock everything behind her sternum and feed it carefully, coal and patience. She had run through a storm for 3 days toward the most dangerous territory she could think of, because dying somewhere else was the other option. She had not, in any version of the future she'd been able to imagine during those years, imagined this. And yet it was the most logical conclusion she had ever arrived at, the most coherent ending to the sequence of events that had begun the night she went through the gap in the eastern fence. Every choice she'd made, every piece of information she'd collected, every wound she'd carried, and every moment she'd chosen to continue, it had all been building toward the specific, unambiguous fact of this man and this hall and this question. "Yes," she said, simply, completely, without performance, because it didn't need any. The bond completed. She felt it the way she'd felt the wolf awakening, not gradually, but all at once, the door swinging open to a space that turned out to have been waiting. Ronan's presence in the bond was exactly what she should have expected from him. Steady, warm, direct, carrying the same controlled amber that had been the constant of every interaction they'd had. The hall responded with a sound that she felt in her sternum. He took her hand, both of them this time, her scarred hands in his, and held them with the same attention he'd shown in the courtyard after the assault, the careful, specific attention for the record written into her skin. Then he looked at the hall. "I want to say one more thing," he said, "and I want the neutral witnesses to include it in their formal record." He paused. "This pack's territory will never again recognize the legal classification of wolfkind as property, not in trade negotiations, not in alliance agreements, not in any document bearing our mark. Any pack seeking alliance with Draegor territory will accept this as a condition of the alliance. Any pack that trades in the classification that was used against this woman," he paused, "will find what Blackridge found." He let that settle. "Sever," he said. "My lord," Sever said, "draft the formal statute." "Already started," Sever said. "Yesterday." The almost smile that she had catalogued across 11 days appeared on Ronan's face in its fullest version, not the corner of the mouth flicker of a contained man allowing a small thing through, but an actual, complete, unguarded smile that transformed his face in a way that made several people in the room visibly recalibrate their understanding of him. She stored it. In the place behind her sternum, where she had kept the fire and the coal and the patience for 22 years, she stored it as carefully as she had ever stored anything. But 3 weeks after this gathering, she stood at the top of the mountain ridge above the Draegor fortress. Not because she was running, because she had come here deliberately, in the gray gold hour before the rest of the fortress woke, to be at the highest point of the territory she now belonged to. Not as property, not as a collected asset, not as a managed liability, as its queen, as herself. The northern reaches spread below her in every direction. The black pine forests, the silver rivers, the distant line of the eastern boundary where Blackridge's territory began and where, according to the documentation that was now registered with the Northern Reaches Council, they kept their distance. The Heron Reach had formally dissolved their alliance with Blackridge 2 weeks ago and sent an alliance inquiry to Draegor territory, which Ronan had reviewed with her at the tactical table before responding. The 11 wolves from the Blackridge compound had arrived 4 days after the Ridge documentation, escorted by a neutral pack representative and in the specific condition of people who had been held long enough that freedom felt structurally foreign and needed careful handling. She had met each of them herself. She had said, "I know what you just came from. I know what it takes to be in the room I just left. You're not there anymore." 3 of them were staying in Draegor territory. The others had chosen to move on to their own various destinations, with resources and documentation, and for the first time in however long they'd been held, the option to make the choice themselves. She thought about those 3, and about the infrastructure she was building with Wren and Lace for receiving wolves in similar circumstances, and about the formal statute that Seaver had drafted and Ronan had signed, and that was spreading through pack networks in ways that Brack tracked with quiet satisfaction. The territory below her was the same territory that Ronan Draegor had held for years before she arrived. Same geography, same resources, same 63 wolves. Something was different, though. She felt it in the 3 weeks she'd been living in it as its queen rather than as a guest with uncertain tenure. The pack felt different. Not larger or louder, but more certain of itself in the way that communities became more certain of themselves when they could see clearly what they stood for and were willing to act on it. She had not done that alone, but she had, she thought, standing on the mountain ridge in the pre-dawn and being honest with herself in the way that high places invited, been the thing that made it visible, the catalyst that had forced the latent into the actual. She heard him before she saw him. She always heard Ronan before she saw him now. The bond carried his approach the way a string carried sound, an awareness so seamless she'd stopped noticing it as a separate sense. He came to stand beside her at the ridge's edge. "You were gone when I woke up," he said. "I needed to see it from up here," she said. He looked out at the territory below them. His territory, their territory now. "What do you see?" he said. She thought about the question the way she thought about everything, not looking for the easy answer, looking for the accurate one. "A place worth what it costs to get here," she said, "and something I'm going to spend a long time figuring out how to deserve." "You already deserve it," he said. "I know," she said, "but I'm going to do it anyway." He looked at her sideways. The pre-dawn light was growing, that specific gray gold that she had come to associate with this territory in particular, the way every place had its own version of light that you only learned by staying long enough. "The Pack Council meeting is at the 2nd hour, he said. "I know. Bracht has 17 items for review." "I know, he told me last night, 12 of them are mine." A pause. "Sever thinks your proposed training integration for newly arrived wolves is going to require additional resource allocation." "Sever's right. I'm going to ask the council for it." "They'll give it to you," he said. Simply. Without the caveat she once would have expected. Probably, most likely, I think. Just the flat certainty of a man who had watched his pack make up its mind about something. She looked at him. "You don't know that." "I watched Seaver spend 2 hours last night on the draft implementation plan For your training integration, Ronan said. For a program he thinks requires additional resources that he is going to argue you should have. The almost smile. I know that. She looked back at the territory. Below them, the fortress was beginning to show the first signs of morning activity. A light in the kitchen, a figure on the wall walk beginning the dawn rotation. The ordinary, irreplaceable evidence of a community going about its life with the specificity that only actual living produced. Corvin, who had been stable for 2 weeks and was back on half duty, would be at his post by the 3rd hour. Tam was leading the morning training run. She'd agreed to join it 3 times a week and had found, to her own surprise, that she liked it. The pack in motion, the specific community of effort. Lise had sent a communication request to 2 southern packs about the new alliance terms and expected responses within the week. And somewhere in the structured archive that Brack kept with obsessive thoroughness, there was documentation, formal, witnessed, registered with every relevant authority in the northern reaches, that contained the terms Drace Holt had signed on the eastern ridge. That contained the statute Seaver had drafted. That contained the bond claim and its acknowledgement by 63 wolves and 4 neutral witnesses. Documentation that said, this is what happened here. This is what was decided. This stands. She had spent 7 years as property. She had spent 3 days running through a storm. She had spent 8 days inside a fortress, remaking the terms of every relevant equation. And she had spent 3 weeks beginning to understand what it meant to have a home, not a place that tolerated her presence, not a compound she was contained in, but a territory she was woven into that carried her mark and was changed by her existence in it. The sun broke over the eastern ridge. Its light came across the black pine forests and the silver rivers and the wide stone battlements of the Draegor fortress, and found her standing at the mountain's peak, luminous scarred, wolf-awake, wholly present. Ronan's hand found hers. She let it. Below them, the pack was waking. The day was beginning. There was a council meeting at the 2nd hour with 17 items, and 12 of them were hers, and Seaver was revising an implementation plan, and 3 wolves who had come from a compound in the east were sleeping in the fortress and would wake up in rooms with doors that locked from the inside. She had not been made for this by kindness. She had been made for it by everything that had tried to unmake her, every wound absorbed, every year endured, every moment she had chosen forward over the alternative. She was not what they had shaped. She was what she had built from the material they had given her, in the fire they hadn't known they were lighting, toward the threshold they'd never considered she might cross. The girl who had once run for her life stood at the mountain's peak and looked at the world she had walked into and claimed with her own hands. She was not prey. She was not property. She was not the sum of what had been done to her. She was Arden Vale, pain-bearer, wolf queen, the woman who had crossed the boundary marker at dawn and remade everything on the other side of it. The morning was clear and cold and entirely, completely hers.